The story begins with a group of people living their lives normally in a busy city. In the middle of so many people, a woman carries her things, walking in a hurry. The girl sighs, complaining that the bag was too heavy. She was already stressed because she was waiting for someone who hadn't arrived yet. The young woman was thinking about how she would torture the guy when they met, when her arm was pulled, and a friendly guy apologizes for coming close so suddenly, but he had seen the protagonist earlier and needed to say that her eyes were very pretty. Besides that, the girl had a cheerful aura, but before the stranger could finish the compliment, the girl cut him off, saying she was Taoist, and because of that wasn't interested in other beliefs. Of course, it was just an excuse to get out of there. And before he could say anything, our protagonist runs away quickly, until she sees a group of very peculiar people. Apparently, there was some kind of event happening there, from a church called True Love Church, and all the people socializing, spreading the word to those passing by. And it didn't take long for them to notice the protagonist's presence, who soon realized she shouldn't have just run anywhere like that. Two ladies come closer with the excuse that they would love the girl to visit their church, offering some kind of coffee. But it was clear they wanted to convert the girl at any cost. Trying to get away from this, the girl says she already went to church and that Jesus was her Lord, which surprised the ladies. And one of them asked which congregation she attended. But all the girl says is that they wouldn't know the church, and she runs away again from those crazy women. The girl runs as if the devil was running from the cross. Meanwhile, she thought about all the religions and gods in the world, from Buddhism to Hinduism to Catholicism and Christianity. For her, it even made sense that they existed. After all, people needed to express their hopes and desires in some way that was at least healthy. However, in that crowd, she knew there were atheists or agnostics passing by. And until not long ago, she herself was part of that group. Until in her thoughtful walk, she bumps into another stranger. The protagonist, however, decided to stop and think more deeply about her own existence, which she thought was pathetic and kind of sad. And she realized she always thought the gods were imaginary, or that they had simply stopped doing what they had to do. Suddenly, the stranger pulls her bag strongly, scaring her. Even so, the girl was reflecting that maybe those gods only existed to take joy in seeing human suffering. The guy, who seemed to be someone the protagonist knew, asks if she didn't remember what he had said about her walking around alone because he had been looking for her. And the girl yells, asking back what was wrong with him. After all, she had made it clear that she was going to buy some things after class and they had agreed to meet at the store. The guy confesses he didn't remember that, leaving her even more stressed since it was him who disappeared. Calmer, she asks where the boy had gone, while thinking she had never believed in a religion as much as now. The guy answers that he was thinking about something more specifically about someone called Hera, which surprised the girl who believed in a god who took a weight off her shoulders and warmed her heart, filling her hands with heat. The guy gets excited saying he had found another clue, so he wanted the two of them to try a little harder to discover something that night. And this makes the girl uneasy, since she wasn't exactly excited to do that. However, her acquaintance kisses her on the cheek, leaving the girl embarrassed, and saying that she should be excited. After all, his plans were to bother her all night. The comment leaves the girl awkward, and she complains because the guy hadn't let her sleep the night before and was still teasing her. The two are interrupted by two ladies scolding the couple for talking like that in the middle of the street. The protagonist sighs, reminding the guy that she had asked him to speak lower when talking about delicate matters like that. And then he suggests they go to a more cozy and private place, with which the girl agrees, nodding her head with her face red as a pepper. Then the two continue walking. The boy's name was Maud, and he had come straight from heaven to help the protagonist become the next god of the sun. The moment he appeared in front of her like a true miracle, she became a believer. Now, face to face with the future god, the girl received a touch on her face as if it was the most precious thing in the world. He sealed her lips with a loving kiss. After all, Maud was her boyfriend and also a god. In my opinion, a god in every sense. When they finished their caresses, it was clear that no matter who saw them, they could notice it was not normal, because the boy managed to make them disappear from the middle of the street with just that kiss. But to understand this story better, we need to go back 2 months earlier in the sanctuary of Loca, where a man was running desperately. He entered his master's room shouting for him. However, the man was still sleeping and complained when he was woken up by the subordinate, who explained that they could not wait any longer because the D-Day had arrived. Still, the grumpy king threw a pillow in his face, telling him to go away, and saying that he needed to sleep while getting up with a terrible hangover face. The subordinate even covered his mouth from that smell and asked how much alcohol he had drunk the night before, since he had hidden all the bottles from the house. But the god argued with him, saying he thought he had hired an easier servant, and suggesting that maybe it would be better to send him to Earth to reincarnate again, because he was getting tired of the boy. The subordinate didn't even answer, looking used to it, and said that his master needed to wake up and clean himself, because the god of the sun had called an assembly in 1 hour. But the man said he would not go, leaving his subordinate with no options. Besides starting to shout, saying that it was D-Day and he couldn't do that kind of thing. But to be honest, his master had no idea what he was talking about. That was when the boy explained that it was the day for the Sun King to choose his successor. In other words, the next sun god who would rule paradise for the next 1,000 years. Even though that was still a secret, the servant told his master to get cleaned up. But all the man did was say that he would have to congratulate his brother Vero later. And looking for his wine bottle, he commented that maybe he could ask for better drinks once the boy became a god. And his servant couldn't even say anything back, because the fire goddess named Leia materialized in his room, making her disciples appear, while the lady ordered Loca to change clothes quickly and look presentable for the meeting. He knelt before the presence of that magnificent and powerful goddess, as did his servant, and she soon told them both to stand, referring to him as her child, leaving the man speechless. The woman sighed in disbelief. It had been 23 years since the two last met, and although it felt like almost a second to the gods, for humans, it was enough time for someone to reach adult maturity. When the man stood up, he started to argue, saying he had no desire at all to become the sun god. And he asked if the woman had no idea about that. She pointed her finger, using her magic, to place more proper clothes on him. But all Leia said was for him to stay quiet and leave that room quickly, because that day would be marked as a new beginning for him. In that kind of Olympus complex, the energy was surreal, and the palace was filled with a celestial magical aura. It was very similar to the Roman gods, considering its ancient architecture. Leia walks toward her throne, sitting on it and finding a long-haired man, still unknown. And by the way, he looked very serious. On the stairs ahead, the subjects were excited about that meeting, and two groups prevailed: the new immortals and the old immortals. The man coughs, calling everyone's attention, saying he was happy to see his brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters gathered there. And of course, glad with Leia's presence right by his side. For him, that made the day even more blessed. And he reaches out to caress the lady's hand, who thanks her lord for the kindness. The groups just watch that public show of affection on the throne. One of them comments to another person that it was absurd to think those two adults were not married, even after 100 years with that so-called platonic thing. And the girl shrugs, suggesting that the talk about being platonic could just be talk after all. It doesn't take long before a whole group gathers to discuss their relationship, asking if they had called everyone there to finally announce their marriage. After all, it didn't seem like there were many other reasons for it. That was when the man intervened, striking his staff on the ground and telling everyone to be quiet. He explains that he had gathered them all because his time as ruler of paradise was coming to an end. So he wanted to discuss with the community who would be his successor. And that really surprised everyone there, who stared open-mouthed at the current sun god. One person comments that they thought the bearded man would name his own son as successor. Loca, however, another person replies, asking what kind of claim that was. Because the Lord had already chosen Vero, the god of the candle, as his heir, and uproar forms among the new and old immortals, since part of them thought a god from the origin of death could not be the new sun god, while the others argued that Loca had terrible behavior to become god. One of the women there shouts, asking why, if Loca was to be named the new sun god, they had to consider that the third-class god of light had spent years dishonoring the name and dignity of the immortals. And she says that instead of doing his role and fulfilling his responsibilities as a god, he had done such a horrible job that it made no sense for him to be chosen as successor, reminding everyone that not only had Loca made a scandal by secretly getting involved with a mortal dancer, but he had also spent the last 20 years drinking heavily and hurting himself just because he heard he was chosen to reincarnate. Meanwhile, Master Vero, even though he was of human origin, had worked hard during those last 20 years to reach the position of god. But the fact he had that origin didn't please the old immortals at all. The sun god asks them to stop the arguing, calling both Vero and Loca to come closer, and so they slowly do. And each introduces himself, Loca as the god of light, and Vero as the god of candles. The king asks if they had heard the arguments of the groups present, which the boys confirm. And then with a serious look, The sun god says that for 1,000 years he had witnessed the battle between those who were born with the gift of immortality and those who were born as humans and joined that family, becoming gods. But until then, the title of sun god had never been passed to a new immortal. And that mention makes Vero pay attention, since he was of human origin. The people were already ready to argue with the god. When he shouted that, still there was a small detail. After thinking a lot, the man explains that he decided to give a chance to those two brothers, and the announcement leaves people open-mouthed. Basically, they would receive the same mission, to go down to the world of mortals. And that surprises both Loca and Vero. The new and old immortals comment among themselves how absurd that was. After all, what could a god do in that world? And when the fifth sun god sent his own successor to the world of humans, that boy ended up loving someone and getting married. And then, because of that, the sun god had to continue his reign for another 1,000 years before finding another successor. Ignoring the comments, the man says that the two boys would have to go down to the real world and find a woman, which makes both of them question his decision even more. But the god was very confident, explaining that, as they already knew, the sun god was the ruler of all the other gods. However, it was the goddess Leia and her approval that gave his reign legitimacy. And he explains this while looking at the woman with affection, receiving a kind smile in return. Continuing, the god explains that the future successor must be recognized as a great companion by a woman who carried the essence of the sun itself. However, this woman who would take Leia's place still lived in the mortal world. Vero interrupts, asking what they could do when they finally found her. And the Lord explains that this woman would carry the Ring of Fire, the symbol of the fire goddess. But she probably would have no idea about it, because this ring was proof of her old life as an immortal. This idea was very interesting for Vero. And the god adjusts himself in the middle of all that confusion, telling them to pay close attention, and then making the ring appear in front of the two boys who are left open-mouthed. Loca, who stares at the jewel seriously, as if he knew that ring very well. Some memories come to his mind of when he gave the jewel to someone very special to him. The boy was red like a pepper at that moment, and the woman seemed focused on finding the perfect fit on her finger, before saying she was very happy. Back to the present, the subjects were interested in that proposal, and Leia seemed satisfied with all of it. The two gods stand up to give the final orders, and they said that the one who could awaken the goddess inside the woman, now mortal, and received the Ring of Fire in return, would be declared the successor of the sun god. And then he dismisses his sons so they would go down to the real world without wasting more time, warning that they should present themselves in the simplest way possible when they descended. Something Vero agreed with. Noticing the silence of his other son, the god insists, asking if he had not heard, which makes the boy tremble, before kneeling and confirming that he had understood everything. Still in paradise, Loca is called by one of his subordinates who carried a bag with his belongings and asked what was wrong with him. All that the god of light could say was the name of someone, Hera, but the servant didn't hear, and just reminded him of the new duty of having to find the Ring of Fire, saying that he had a map that would show the exact location of the icon, pulling out a device while trying to read the name of the place he would go to, revealing the Republic of Korea, which drew even more attention from the boy who couldn't get Hera's image out of his head. He was willing to find the woman no matter what. Meanwhile, in the real world, someone sneezed while at work, wondering if someone was talking about her to make her feel that way, as the good superstition said, and showing the face of our protagonist. After that forced memory, Loca decided to visit someone very important. Arriving at Hera's grave, he runs his hand over the cold stone, as if he could touch the very face of his old beloved. And sadly, he says they had arrived at a place, but his subordinate denies it, explaining that, according to his navigation, they had not arrived yet, making the boy yell for him to shut up, to which the subordinate answers that he would leave them alone for a moment, if that's what he wanted. The boy looks again at the girl's grave, running his hand over her tombstone again, hoping to receive some sign. Loca talks to that piece of concrete, saying that he had spent the last 23 years trying to forget her, since the night he proposed to her, and she simply disappeared without even saying goodbye. And, to be honest, he only wanted to see her again. And he said that among his tears, wetting the grave while staring at Hera's photo, which now was the only memory the boy had. Meanwhile, in a counseling center for children, our protagonist was looking at some little boys playing until one boy caught her attention, making the woman ask if he had fun that day. But Seojin only answers that it was his turn to talk to the counselor, She enters that room full of toys and sits, being stared at by an older woman in an awkward silence, which is broken by the professional, asking how her day was. To which she answers that it was fine, exactly like the last time, which didn't sound very convincing. Then the woman asks how many part-time jobs she currently had, and Miso feels uneasy to answer that it was 2, which creates an even more awkward silence between the two women. Even trying to stay polite, the woman burns inside scolding Miso because she had promised that she would quit at least 1 job. Ashamed of her real situation, she explains that in fact she was in 3 jobs, but she would surely find one to quit. The woman seems disappointed, sighing while trying to scold the girl. She explains that it was exactly for this reason she insisted on meeting the young woman after her sessions with Seojin, and she explains that this amount of work also influenced and affected her nephew, which was something the protagonist knew and felt ashamed of the reality. Writing it down on her file, the professional asks if the girl was still having trouble sleeping, which she confirms, and then asks how she spent her free time. To which the girl answers, she explains that normally she watched some movies, positively surprising the woman. Then Miso explains that as soon as they ended, she played them all over again and again, endlessly, which was a little worrying for the lady who asked what kind of movies she liked to watch, leaving her a bit embarrassed, but the woman answers that normally they were movies like Harry Potter and nerd movies like The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, The Two Towers. A little worried about the mental serenity of that girl in front of her, the doctor asks if she didn't prefer to continue that conversation in the next session. And Miso doesn't think twice before accepting that proposal. She walks slowly through the corridors, observing the world around her. Thoughtful, Miso Lee, our girl, had turned 23 that same year. And the child she always took care of, her nephew Seojin, Ion, went with her 4 times a year to that place. That was because the boy lost his parents when he was 5. The same happened to Miso in her teenage years, at 15. When she arrives at the place where her sister's ashes were, the woman starts giving news about her sister's son, explaining that he was receiving social therapy regularly and ends up letting slip that the center seemed more worried about her than about the little boy. But she decides that was a terrible idea and tries not to waste her late sister's time with such negative things. The boy asks if that was all she had to say, but the woman explains she still had much more, telling her sister that now her son had turned 7 years old, and the bold boy asks if they had gone that far, just for her to say those things, making the woman nervous and telling him to open his mouth if that's what he wanted. And then Seojin reveals to his mother that her sister wasn't able to sleep and was still using some very strange social masks, making Miso upset. She scolds the boy, asking how he could say that kind of thing in front of his own mother. But he only answers that she lived her life one way, and he lived his another. Even while scolding the boy, being in his company made Miso very happy. And while squeezing his cheeks, Seojin asked her to let him go right away. He was different from other children. Even though she had tried every kind of therapy possible, it was hard to deal with a child with an IQ of 150. Besides that, any discomfort he felt was Miso's responsibility. Miso, which made everything much harder. While they were talking, the boy asked for something to fall from the sky and help him with that situation. He was a sensitive boy and held his aunt's hand, calling her to move on together. The two slowly went down the cemetery stairs until Miso broke the silence, asking what he meant when he spoke about something falling from the sky earlier. But the boy, with his head down, answers that it was nothing important, Miso. He just wanted some extra help from the sky. And at that moment, by pure coincidence, a man fell to the ground right in front of the two. They couldn't believe that had really happened in a cemetery of all places it could. The pair stayed in silence, just staring at that boy without knowing what to say. At least until the woman shouted, asking if that in front of her was really a man, while Seojin celebrated his prayers being answered. As the boy stood up with difficulty, the protagonist asked if he was okay, hearing the boy groan in pain. It was Loca who was in front of her, even though she didn't know he was a possible successor of a sun god. The boy shouts, asking what was happening there and grumbling that his father couldn't have just thrown him that way, looking for another person. While Miso stared at him, trying to get his attention, even without knowing for sure how that boy had ended up there. Then she suggests that the boy might have just been cleaning the ceiling, which seems to offend the god, who asks how could he be cleaning and getting closer? He questions how Miso dared to talk that way, making her even more scared with the whole situation. Tired, he shouts, asking if there was another mortal there. leaving the protagonist without knowing what to answer. Until the guy goes crazy, screaming for Hera nonstop afraid, Miso pulls Seojin, explaining that she thought that man was not in his best days, so it was better for the two of them to just leave right away. However, before they could do that, they are stopped by the boy, who calls their attention. While Seojin stared at that man who appeared out of nowhere, a little scared, his aunt tried to stay neutral, asking if she could help. And Loca answers with another question, asking if those two were the only people, or better, the only women present in that place, which completely surprises Seojin and makes him complain that he was a boy, and he was 7 years old. With that statement, Loca asks if, then, the one he was looking for was Miso. But the woman gets annoyed, asking what that man had taken and calling her nephew so the two could just move on with their lives because that guy was clearly crazy. Before they could, however, the god pulls the woman by the shoulder, saying he wasn't finished yet. But he quickly gets a warning from the boy, who tells him to be careful. Only Loca didn't understand what he was talking about. But before he could finish his questions, he is hit by a punch, thrown by the woman in a very imposing way. She stares at the ground for a few seconds, biting her lip for her action, before screaming, desperate because her hand hurt a lot from that impact. Her nephew asks if she was okay, and the woman caresses her hand. And then, Seojin turns to that guy, still unknown to them both, asking what was wrong with him, and why he was trying to hurt his aunt. That whole situation was making the god even more anxious. He couldn't believe that was really happening. Finally, his helper Hajung comes down to earth, apologizing to his master for being late. Then, without delay, Loca states that he had fallen almost on top of Miso, and the subordinate celebrates because that probably meant they had found Hera's reincarnation. However, seeing that whole scene, the subordinate couldn't help but ask why everything was so messy. While staring at Seojin, who was calling the police to report a man who was trying to bother his aunt, Miso shouts, pointing at the two unknown men's faces and saying that they had messed with the wrong woman because she wouldn't just let that situation pass. And she tells the two idiots to go to jail, while Loca could only stare at her, remembering Hera's image again and again. But now, the woman in front of him, who was supposed to be the reincarnation of the goddess, had a very different image, which made Loca go into denial. And he screams, asking where his beloved was, while the police arrived at the place. At the police station, the atmosphere was in confusion because a guy was trying to convince the police officers that he had been hit first. The man argued with the officer, asking if he even knew who he was and how important he would be. But the chief only told him to calm down. The two end up jumping in fright when they hear an unknown scream from someone saying she was telling the truth. It was Miso explaining that she and her nephew were in the cemetery when a mysterious man fell from the sky and started yelling at her. And Seojin adds that the two were almost certain that this man had really fallen from the sky itself. The police officer looked at her, not believing, explaining again that when they arrived at the place, there was no one else besides the two. And that's why it was hard to believe that whole story. However, the woman shows her injured hand, telling him to take a good look and asking if the officer thought she had done that to herself, on purpose. And besides, she tells him to check the recordings. The police officer explains that he had already looked, and in fact, there was no one with the pair. In the recordings, it really wasn't possible to see Loca and his subordinate at any time, but the girl couldn't believe it. Shocked, she tried to find an explanation for that whole event. It wasn't as if she was alone, after all. Her nephew also saw all of that happen. She couldn't believe what was happening and shouted at the chief. He explains that he understood the fact she was upset, but asked her to compose herself, even if only for the sake of the people she loved and who had died. As they left the station, the woman talked to herself, asking if she had seen things or what. But her hand was still all hurt. And then she asked Seojin what they should do, until the little boy suggested that maybe they had been attacked by ghosts. But the woman was sure that ghosts didn't exist. Something that Seojin argued that in the books the woman read, they were present. While they walked, Loca and Hajung watched them discreetly, not really knowing what to think about the whole situation. It doesn't take long for the god of light to question his subordinate again about Hera's true reincarnation, asking if he was sure they were in the right place and that this was the right woman. Something Hajung quickly confirms, and now that they were face to face with the girl, he had no doubt that she carried the ring of fire. His boss pulls the tablet from his hand, deciding to solve that misunderstanding himself. However, he doesn't find any inconsistency, which makes him even more doubtful. He didn't know how that ill-mannered woman could be the reincarnation of his great love. But there was no room for big questions. and Hajung reaffirms that she was the one they were looking for. Loca calls the subordinate by his name, which makes the boy tremble in fear. Hajung was serious when he said they needed to find out more about that girl. Sometime later, at Seojin's school, the woman dropped him off at his class as always, watching the many parents who also left their own children there. Holding the boy's shoulders, she wished him to have fun. And he told her not to forget to pick him up at 6 in the evening, something that apparently the woman was almost letting slip already. She watched her nephew enter the building with extreme melancholy, remembering when she read the Harry Potter book for the first time, when she was still a child. But back then, she couldn't understand the hard things that happened in the protagonist's life. However, after the horror and difficulties she went through in her own life, Miso started to think that maybe her life was a little worse than those characters in the books she loved so much. Still, she tried everything possible and impossible not to think of her family as pitiful or anything like that, because that was the only way to make sure her young nephew had a life that was a little less tragic. And that was the reason why she liked fantasy books even more now. It was because the protagonist was always saved by magic in those stories. However, unfortunately for her, Miso did not have a fantasy life. It was more like she lived in a documentary about very unusual experiences. Inside a restaurant, the kitchen atmosphere was as chaotic as usual, calling for more dishes and handling the table orders normally. Miso finally arrived, apologizing for being late, and her boss celebrated her arrival, shouting that table 8 was asking for more grilled beam fish and some anchovies, something the girl would handle right away, even though she was bothered by all the shouting from that woman. Sometimes she fantasized about hitting her face, but she knew she couldn't do that because she needed to pay for her nephew's counseling center. It didn't take long for the woman to notice the worker's bandaged hand and ask what had happened, but Miso hid it, saying it was nothing serious, just an allergy she had, but that she would do her job normally. While saying this, she only prayed not to be fired because of such a small wound. She was getting more and more bothered by the results of her interaction with that mysterious man. She even started to feel angry at him. She slowly entered the kitchen to ask if the order for table 8 was ready, but the cook explained that only one thing was missing. Then he handed her another order, explaining that the one for table 10 would be ready in about 3 minutes. The girl thought of thanking him, but noticed that cook looked very familiar. She just had no idea from where. She thought for a moment while the boy went on with his tasks, until she shouted at him again, saying that he was the boy from the cemetery. Meanwhile, in paradise, more specifically in Vero's room, a girl approached the god who explained that if she kept coming there all the time, her father would get a very wrong idea about the two of them. But the girl ignored him, asking when he would leave, explaining that Master Loca had already gone to the mortal world along with the navigation system. And the boy found it curious that Leia had given that device to her son. And the girl explained that she didn't know if the boy knew about the system, but she was sure his servants did. Then the boy asked if the current sun god knew about the existence of that system. But the girl didn't know that part. She only knew about Leia's help in this case. However, she was interrupted by the boy who stood up, saying he didn't want to hear about those things anymore, leaving the girl desperate until she grabbed him, saying she was very worried. He came closer to Sion to ask why she was so worried, and stroked her hair while the girl tried to compose herself and catch her breath to answer. However, she bit her lips, changing the subject and saying that it wasn't important. But she swore she would help him become the sun god without a second thought, something that seemed to make him very happy. After all, he came very close to the girl, saying that the two of them had a great agreement. And finally, he kissed Sion, who even tried to scold him for a moment, but was taken by the boy. She enjoyed that moment between the two, emotional. While Vero only thought that, before going down, he needed to do something very important. Inside the restaurant, Miso's boss yelled, asking what had happened and what was wrong with the girl. The woman was very angry, wanting to know what Miso was thinking by shouting in front of all those customers. And she didn't even let the protagonist explain what had happened, complaining that her worker already knew business wasn't going very well since a YouTuber complained about the rude service in the place. And now Miso wanted to cause another scandal there. But the girl apologized, even though she knew the complaints were valid. After all, her boss was miserable when it came to the amount of food served on the plates. Stressed, the woman tells her subordinate to forget it and just go do her job. And so Miso does, serving a table that asked for a bottle of soju. They also wanted some boiled eggs and something else that Miso didn't even hear, because she was too busy trying to understand what that mysterious guy was doing in her workplace. The next morning, in a corner cafe, the girl got ready for another shift. She had huge dark circles under her eyes and grumbled about how much she hated her life. After putting on the uniform, she could only think that morning shifts were always the worst, especially after only getting 2 hours of sleep. While yawning, her coworker warned her to be careful not to end up forcing her jaw too much. Realizing who the coworker was, the woman screamed. It was the same guy from the day before, who had even been at her other job. And because of that, she started shouting, trying to find the right words to ask what he was doing there while Loca pretended not to understand. She noticed a small detail on his clothes. The name printed on the tag was Maud, definitely not common around there. Then the guy explained it was because he was a male god and asked if she had a problem with that. His answer made the girl even angrier. She didn't understand why the guy was messing with her like that and even questioned his mental sanity. But she had no time for that, because a line of customers was waiting. And the guy called her attention, saying they were just waiting for her, which brought her back to reality. Later, in one of those co-working cafes, the girl was getting ready for another shift, apologizing to her boss for being late because of the traffic jam. And one of her coworkers turned around, asking if that was really the reason for her delay, and suggesting she should have taken the subway, asking if she was an idiot or what. To her surprise, it was Loca again right in front of her. He sighed when looking at the girl, even without really knowing her. Closer to her, Loca asked if Miso couldn't stop with that dumb face and start using her brain, making her take a step back. Not knowing what to say, the protagonist just agreed with the boy, who stared back at her, thinking that even if she was a reincarnation, there was no way that clumsy woman could be Hera. After all, if she really was, he would have felt something different while seeing all the terror in her eyes. Miso got stressed and quickly asked who that man was. Teasing her, he suggested the girl try to guess. And his eyes turned dark when she asked if Loca was a stalker. But he only said that possibility was absurd and pointed to the girl's stupidity. Then he put his hand on her forehead, making her groan before he explained the real situation, revealing that he was a god, like an omnipotent, powerful god, even if it wasn't such a big deal. He even reminded her that he had said that earlier, pointing to the spot where the tag with his supposed name had been. That made Miso remember the talk about him being a male god, but the girl only thought that man really needed psychological help. She stuttered at seeing that craziness. And Loca waved his hand in front of her to see if Miso was still in her right mind, explaining that he understood she was a bit shocked, but he wanted her to say something already. And all that came out of the girl's mouth was that he was a crazy stalker. Trying to be nicer, he explained that he knew it was a lot of new information to process. But he moved closer to her body and asked if she happened to have any jewel with a red ruby in the center. Something like that. While Miso turned her neck, he tried to find the jewel. With her back turned, he tried to see if the ring in question was on her neck, making her scream and try to kick him hard, calling him a psychopath. However, to her bad luck, the boy managed to grab her foot without any difficulty. And he still mocks, reminding her that she had already broken her hand and asking if now she was trying to break a leg too, commenting that the girl loved to live life dangerously, which makes Miso complain even more, and that she should take more care of her own body. When he lets go of the girl's foot, she ends up falling to the ground, cursing him completely while the boy just mocks. The protagonist yells at the guy, saying he was a crazy stalker and would definitely report him to the police. She also asks how the boy managed to find her at her workplace, questioning if he had checked her background with some detective or what. While she asked if Loca was following her and if that was the case, what he wanted from her. The customers were already recording the whole situation. After all, that was quite an accusation. And the guy's posture was strange. Out of patience, he turns to Miso, telling her to shut up and asking if she never listened to people. Until his subordinate enters through the door, calling for his master, and shows his new document explaining that he couldn't get a permanent identity for the boy, but had a temporary one he could use. Then he notices Miso's presence, celebrating for having Hera there. But his boss tells him not to call the girl that because she was nothing like Hera, while the protagonist shouted, asking who that person was. Before Loca could answer that it was none of her business, he is stopped by Hajung, who explains that the situation was already complicated enough for him to still want to act like that. And then he turns to the protagonist with a kind smile, trying to explain politely that they had come from very far away to find something very important. And then, he respectfully asks if Miso had any rings she received when she was born, suggesting it could even be an inheritance from her mother or something like that, because it was something he and his master really needed. The boy explains that the ring had a stone in the middle that was medium in size. While Miso listened to his explanation with an annoyed face, he adds that this stone was very shiny and had a kind of spiritual feeling. When she looks for something in her pocket, that makes Hajung even more excited. He turns, telling his master that he had warned him they had found the right person. Loca also stares at the girl's movement, shocked at the fact that she could really be Hera. Then the girl holds out 2 thin rings, showing them and explaining that she had 2 more like those at home, but nothing much like what Hajung had described. She even adds that she doubted that was what they were looking for. The sight leaves both of them speechless. Noticing they were disappointed, the girl gets irritated, putting her rings away and telling them both to leave her alone already, instead of wasting her time with that kind of thing. Hajung even thinks of saying something, of asking Miso to go, but it is too late. While Loca comments that this had been a mission given by his father after all, and missions like that were never easy. He even remembers that the sun god warned that the ring in question would be inside the body of the successor of the fire goddess. So, for Hajung, it was clear they needed to make Miso remember her past first, but they could only do that if she trusted the 2 of them, which meant they would have to keep insisting on something that Loca definitely didn't feel like doing. Noticing the 2 still there, Miso shouts directly from the counter she was working at for them to get out of there, and even warns that they were blocking the way of real customers. The 2 turn, staring at her with anger, nodding as if they had some kind of secret deal before leaving the establishment. Miso stares at the door swinging, showing their final exit, and she was already celebrating the fact of never seeing either of them again in her life when someone she already knew well asked who she was talking about. While Loca put on his apron, the girl was horrified, asking what he was doing there. After all, he had just left. But the boy explains that he worked there too, and if she didn't believe his words, she could call their boss, making her scream even more in disbelief. As the day went by, Miso was only getting more surprised by that boy's skills. First, because he served with a speed worthy of a god, and then because the boy was extremely precise. And of course, his perfect cleaning skills. With all that concern, the girl crouched down, dialing on the phone to make a quick call. When her boss finally answered, she tried to explain that she had already arrived but before she could finish, her boss interrupted, apologizing for forgetting to let her know that a new employee was starting that day, which caught her by surprise. The man went on explaining that the new guy studied at a nearby college and his routine fit perfectly with the cafe's hours. And since he said he could start right away, he decided to hire him. But Miso couldn't believe that strange man had really told the truth. Worried, she asked if hiring this new boy meant she was being fired. But her boss reassured her, explaining that the boy was the son of one of his friends and planned to open his own co-working cafe. That's why he decided to show him more or less how things worked, but she didn't need to worry. Stuttering, the girl tried to argue with her boss that the new boy was really strange. Something that didn't surprise the cafe owner, because to him, for sure Loca was not normal, and that caught the girl's attention. While she observed her new coworker, the man explained that he had interviewed Loca earlier that day, and she should be thankful for the favor, because the boy was really handsome. Almost like a god, according to Miso's boss, who was now very busy watching the movements of the stranger who fixed a light in one of the rooms with a snap of his fingers. He ended the call, asking the girl to take good care of the new coworker, and she tried to hold him a little longer without success. She was scared, looking at what Loca had done, because that light had been broken for a while, and she had thought of replacing it, but ended up forgetting. While he moved on to another task, Miso stared at him, running discreetly into the room that was now lit. She stared at the light in disbelief, remembering how it only took a snap of fingers for the boy to fix it. She couldn't stop wondering if that was really real. So she shook her head as if expecting her thoughts to fall out and questioned her own sanity. After all, that had only been a coincidence. Either way, she needed to know what was wrong with that guy. It was very strange for someone to come up to you and ask specifically about a ring. Either way, she was sure she didn't like that boy at all. Meanwhile, Loca was also thinking about her, staring loosely at Miso's back, and biting his lip as he thought that she was indeed the reincarnation of someone he loved so much. Flashbacks of his story with Hera came to mind. Of the two, face to face, in paradise. That day, the woman was surprised by the call of the god of light, asking why he wanted to meet her in secret. And he answered that he needed to do something very important, gently pulling the girl's hand, which she gladly extended to him, until the boy made a beautiful ring appear in his hands. Before asking if she would accept that jewel, sealing their bond once and for all and marrying the boy. Hera stared at the ring for a few seconds, left speechless with those words said by her beloved. A little impatient with that silence, Loca insisted, asking please. And then the woman grabbed him with great joy, unable to believe it. But now that he was side by side with the reincarnation of that same woman, he couldn't feel anything but strangeness while she ate a bag of chips. Noticing she was being watched, she told the boy to stop and asked if he didn't have some work to do or something like that. But all he said was that he couldn't believe she was Hera. The woman angrily replied, telling him to have a bit of respect for someone who was a coworker now, and asked what a Hera was. The boy asked if she didn't watch TV to not know Hera Hong, even questioning if the girl was really Korean. Miso paid some attention to that name, trying to remember a Hera Hong. That was when something came to mind, and she asked if he was referring to the actress who had died 20 years ago. And if that was the case, it was at least strange that Loca was after a dead person right now. Taking the chance, the girl asked again how he had found her job and what exactly that crazy boy wanted from her. He came clean, explaining that even if it was hard to believe, Miso was the reincarnation of Hera, or at least that was what he and Hajong thought. And he explained that the woman in question was in line to become the new goddess of fire, which, theoretically, meant that Miso was next in line, possibly. And this makes the girl widen her eyes, before the awkward silence hangs over the two again, until the god turns, annoyed, asking what he was doing, saying those things, something Miso was also asking herself. He speaks again, being honest that not even he believed this could be true, but explains that the map led him to her, and maybe he could trust that. And his comment makes Miso ask what map he was talking about, something he doesn't answer. In fact, the god explains that he needed to get that ring of fire that resided inside the girl because he needed the jewel to become the next sun god, which meant he couldn't leave the girl's side. Each comment he made left the girl even more disbelieving. This time the argument she used was that he could just be a webtoon author, because it wasn't possible that his head was working properly after so much craziness. That offended Loca, but he tried not to get stressed, saying that either way they would find out the truth soon enough. Changing the focus a little, the boy asks if there was any wine around because he couldn't deal with that whole situation sober. But the girl asks how he could even think about drinking during work hours, until their conversation was interrupted by a call from Seojin's school, which caught Miso by surprise. She answers, introducing herself as the boy's aunt. And on the other end of the line, the teacher shouts, saying that something had happened to him. The girl runs while grabbing her things, screaming when she finds out the little boy had hurt his mouth. She asks several questions, wanting to know if it was a burn, if he was bleeding, and what had happened, besides asking which hospital the boy was in. When she found out, she realized she was in trouble because it would take almost an hour to get there. Even so, the girl assured the school that she was on her way, while Loca watched all her movements. The girl pressed the elevator button compulsively as if that would help it come faster. She didn't know how that could have happened to her nephew. Finally, the elevator arrived, and when she entered, she pressed the button for the first floor repeatedly, just like she had done outside, hoping that giant metal box would hurry. However, before the doors closed, a hand stopped the elevator, making Miso scream. It was Loca, and his approach left her outraged, telling him to get out of there. However, while she pressed the buttons, he explained that the boy was in an X-ray, which was on a different floor from the one she had pressed. But she didn't know what he was talking about and insisted that he get out right away. However, the door closed and the two were alone in the elevator. The girl was out of words to curse that arrogant boy, but she couldn't because she burst into tears thinking of her nephew's well-being. Finally, the elevator reached the first floor, and like before, the girl wished things would happen faster because of her desperation. When the door opened, she got a scare. That was because she was facing the hospital and no longer the cafe where she worked. As the door closed, the boy explained that he had heard it took a whole village to raise a child. But besides that, it was good to have a touch of God. The elevator arrived at floor B2, and the girl kept amazed with all that, just watching the empty hallway. And Loca said that, at that moment, it was even better to have a divine touch in her daily life because the girl needed it more than ever. His words touched Miso for the first time, and she looked at him not knowing what to say. Meanwhile, in the medical center, things worked normally, with patients going here and there. At this point, Miso had already managed to get to her nephew's room, who was resting. Even alone, she grumbled that it was all her fault after all. She always had to keep the boy at school until late. The boy had gone to the school kitchen to get a snack, which made the girl ask if his teachers weren't even feeding him. But at that moment, Seojin woke up, explaining that it wasn't their fault. and that scared Miso, who jumped from the chair while the little boy added, saying that everything was very tasty, especially the spicy rice cakes, which now he wanted more than anything. Miso said she could get some, but asked her nephew to stay quiet because the burn in his mouth was already really bad. A nurse entered the room saying it was time to change his bandage. So Miso suddenly stood up to leave the two alone for the procedure, but ended up bumping into the tray the woman was carrying, dropping the whole kit on the floor. The nurse worried and asked if the woman was okay, but Miso explained that it was no problem and that at this point in her life she was almost a specialist in accidents. Even so, the woman insisted that she take a look at the injury on her face. However, the protagonist reaffirmed that it was nothing serious and ran away, because she didn't want her nephew's treatment to take even longer for something that barely happened. She decides to go to the bathroom, waiting for a stall to free up, when she hears some whispers about a very handsome man and people even wondering if he was a celebrity. The women were going crazy looking at him, amazed by his beauty, while Miso watched him with disgust. Of course, she wasn't blind or anything. She could also notice the good things in him. So she knew he was considered a very handsome man. Even so, she didn't understand what was with him and all those things he had done since they met. Memories of the situations where she met the supposed god made her think that everything he did was impossible to happen. But even so, there he was, sitting in front of her like an ordinary person. She teases him, calling the boy with a little kick, asking why he kept staying there. And Loca suddenly wakes up, widening his eyes. Instead of answering her question, he replies with another one, wanting to know how the child was. To which Miso answers that they still needed to monitor him for a while, and says what happened was that he was holding a pot of hot food and did what any child would do. Standing up slowly, the boy says that in that case he would leave, but the protagonist calls his attention, leaving him with his usual scowling look, but this time she explains that she didn't know if she should thank him or if it was better to worry about what had happened earlier. While he looked at her babbling, Loca couldn't stop thinking that the Hera he knew would never show vulnerability like that, nor show herself lonely and needy. Meanwhile, Miso explains that she knew she wasn't daydreaming or anything like that with what happened in the elevator. Loca puts his hand to caress her face. He knew that if that really was his Hera, she wouldn't even be able to be alone at a moment like that. But Miso pulls him back to reality, moving away from him and asking who said he could touch her like that. Suddenly, the god grabs her hand, making her scream. He goes closer, leaving the girl flustered. All that passed through the boy's head was Hera. Nervous, the protagonist asks what he was doing, but the boy was too lost in thought to hear. He was decided that from then on he would give his blessing, so that all pain and despair would leave that human's heart. By casting this spell, he hoped that the woman's problems would disappear, wishing that her flesh and her mind would be healed of all wounds. At the end of the magic, the god made a pact in his head, that if this all really worked, then he would believe that the one in front of him was the reincarnation of his beloved. The boy noticed that the wound that was once on the girl's delicate face had vanished and caressed her cheek. Only Miso hadn't noticed it, and she screamed asking what had happened. After all, now that she looked, even her hand was healed. She didn't understand what was happening and went to the guy to ask if he was a ghost or a magician or something like that. But Loca denied it, even though he knew the girl would not understand that he was a god, no matter how much he insisted. So the boy pulls Miso by the arm, telling her to follow him. It was already night when the two were talking, and the god had taken the protagonist to the top of the hospital building, and then carefully asked permission to introduce himself. But before he could say his name, he was interrupted by another shout from the girl accusing him of being a vampire, while pointing at the boy, looking at him seriously. She says that she already knew the truth. After all, the boy in front of her had pale skin, very pink lips, and more importantly, shining eyes. The boy couldn't take it anymore when he shouted, asking that human to stop interrupting him. Even so, she kept on the defensive, asking what he wanted, suggesting it might be her blood. Out of patience, the boy asked if she was a fantasy fan or what, which shocked her for being right. But that wasn't important now, because he explained that to tell a bit of his story, she could recognize him as the light that took that world out of darkness, master of luminescences and lanterns made by humans themselves. Because in reality, he was the son of the sun, Loca, the king of light. While she watched his skin glow in enchantments, Miso asked if that was true. The boy said that even though it was shocking, it was normal to have that reaction, considering she was meeting a god for the first time. The girl still resisted to believe. She got closer to the boy, squeezing his arms to check that he was real before asking if he was really a god, something he confirmed. At least until the protagonist confessed that she had never heard of a god of light, which surprised Loca because she was serious. And he asked if the girl had any idea when gods had existed out there. That was when Miso realized that if he really was a god, what he had done earlier in the cafe was magic. So she asked if he could do that at any time, something the boy confirmed, explaining that he could do anything. Testing his patience, the protagonist explains that if he really had those powers, he could reunite his nation by joining South Korea and North Korea again, which makes the boy stressed. His reaction makes Miso think that he was refusing to do something because he couldn't do it. But she remembers that he said he was a divine figure and that he could do anything, so she wanted to see it. But this time Loca shouts back, scolding her for questioning his abilities as a god. Besides that, the reunification of the countries had already been set for 15 years from then on September 22nd, so he couldn't interfere in that matter. The two kept disagreeing, because the girl huffed, asking what kind of useless god he was. After all, bringing peace to the real world should be an easy task for a true god. Then she insists, telling Loca to create a world without war or hunger, and her eyes widen. Before he bites his lip, trying to hold himself back. When the boy positions himself as if to meditate, Miso asks what he was doing there, until she noticed a change in the aura. It was as if the whole place had been surrounded by an enchantment. Even so, the stubborn girl asks if something had happened. And to her surprise, Loca answers with a simple 5 seconds, saying that for 5 whole seconds he had kept the world in terrible peace, banning all the fights in that society during that period, which makes Miso widen her eyes. The protagonist stares at him, disbelieving all that, as if she could see the soul of the boy in front of her. She approaches in silence, with her finger pointed at him as if making an accusation, but asks if he had created world peace. Meanwhile, without patience, Loca throws it back with another question, wanting to know if he needed to repeat what he had done or what. Even so, Miso didn't believe and spoke to the boy as if he was completely crazy, suggesting that there was something wrong with his brain, and leaving the god a little offended with the possibility of her not believing his words. But for her, there was no way. So he steps closer, telling her to explain in a rational way how the two had arrived so quickly at that hospital, or how he fixed the cafe light so fast earlier. And the girl is left speechless. He keeps mentioning the scratch that just a little while ago was on her face and simply disappeared, leaving her scared. She steps back, saying she didn't know exactly how to explain it, but surely everything was just a big coincidence. He stared at the protagonist seriously, as if tired of all that, while she asked herself if that scowling boy could really be a god. She asks why Loca was staring at her like that, but before she could finish, he answers the question she asked in her own head, reaffirming that he really was a god. And he explains that even if her doubts were understandable, he was starting to realize that the girl was finally understanding the situation. That terrifies her. And Miso asks if the boy had just read her mind, to which he answers that he could do it as if he were reading a book. He could see her past memories, but not all of them. The girl keeps stepping back until she hits the wall. She is tricked by Loca, who explains that he was a god and not a demon. And because of that, he wasn't there to try to hurt her. Trembling, the girl asks why he was there then, but he had already answered that before, reminding her that she had the ring of the next goddess of fire and he needed it, leaving her speechless when he showed the jewel's original form. Then, the god explains that all she needed to do was remember her old memories. That is, the memories of her past life. And even though it seemed hard, it wasn't that difficult. He gets closer to her soft hair and makes it clear that he only needed a few things from the girl. Noticing Miso's state, he asks if she was scared, making it clear that he knew it was too much information for any human to accept. And he whispers in her ear an apology, even though she had no choice. After all, he was the god in that situation, while the protagonist was only a human. In the most anticlimactic way possible, the girl's phone rings, interrupting their conversation. It was her co-working cafe boss. She answers desperately, responding to the questions about the register, and apologizes for the fact that no one was watching the shop. Then she decides to be honest and explains that she was at the hospital at that moment. Before she finishes her explanation, the boy turns his back, grumbling before disappearing into the air. The girl couldn't believe that had just happened. That was very different from what had happened between them in the elevator, where the doors opened and closed. Now he had just vanished. Meanwhile, far from there, some birds circled stone buildings. flying quickly with the presence of someone hooded. It was Voadimir, alone and in disguise. He saw a house made of simple wood, and when he heard movements coming from it, he hid behind one of the stones. From inside the small building, a scary man came out, walking slowly. The door of the house glowed as it opened, and another person who was sitting at a table grumbled, asking if the visitor didn't know how to knock on the door. At least until he realized who it was, greeting his master Voadimir and asking what he owed the pleasure of the visit to. And the god greeted the Reaper, commenting that he looked well. The long-haired man asked what brought that god to such an uninhabited place. After all, a man like him had better things to do. Voadimir commented that it was impossible for the Reaper to hide the truth and asked right away if he had a new informant. Something the man denied, apologizing, but that didn't matter to the god of candles. In fact, what really mattered to him was to make it clear that the Reaper had failed. He had a face like a psychopath while asking if the man had forgotten that he was supposed to bring Hera down there. To hell. The Reaper tried to explain what had happened, but he was interrupted by the Master, who made it clear that in that case there was no reason to continue with their deal. And then he said that as soon as he became the new sun god, the man would receive nothing more from him. The Reaper tried to explain that this was out of his control, catching Vodamir's attention. But the redhead turned to him, asking why he was saying that only now after 23 years since he gave the orders. The man's boss appeared, saying that they didn't waste time with his tricks, and saying that if the god already knew that Hera was alive in the mortal world, he wanted to know why he was there now trying to confirm that information. And seriously, he asked the god if he had come to make a new proposal. This approach from the Reaper Master put an ironic smile on the boy's face, who agreed after all, a new deal would be great. Meanwhile, inside his palace, the sun god was hearing shouts and more shouts from some people saying that regardless of the reason, it was wrong to use powers in the presence of a mortal, while another argued that it had only been 5 seconds, and it was absurd to refuse only that time of peace in the world. But it wasn't about their wishes that they were talking, but about the fact that there was a limit between interactions between gods and humans, and that had crossed the line. The argument was angry, and a boy commented that everyone already knew Loca around there. But he was interrupted by a girl asking how a low-class god could use those powers when those who were in higher positions would never dare to do such a thing. Because a god couldn't lower his guard and expose himself like that in front of a mortal whenever he wanted. Besides that, one of the girls argued that it was impossible to accept Loca as the new leader if he kept acting like a clueless madman. And the new immortals were shocked to hear the woman shout that Loca had no right to be an heir. The fight only continued. On one side, they said to shut up and remember whose son he was. And on the other, that was just another reason to raise expectations about the boy. Finally, the sun god intervenes, telling them to stop that, and asking what they were trying to say. Then the serious woman answers that Master Loca should be properly punished for breaking the pact of the gods, and therefore be disqualified as successor to the Lord's throne. The new mortals tell her to be careful with what she said, and were ready to curse her when they were interrupted. The current god states that what they were saying was true. So he would discuss the possibility of Loca being his successor a little later, but he is surprised by his son saying he should not do that. He enters the room slowly and explains that as one of the chosen for possible succession, he had come to the palace to report something very important about the competition, which interests the god a lot, who asks him to say more. Then, taking off his hood, Vladimir explains that the blame for those events should not fall on him or his brother, but on his father, who becomes extremely angry with this public accusation. Even so, the boy keeps his posture, asking if the two could talk alone for a moment. That sudden appearance of Vero leaves his father shocked, and the man quickly asks, angry why the boy was not in the mortal world, exactly as he had been ordered. Then the boy answers that, even though they were powerful gods, meeting a specific mortal was not a simple task. So he needed to prepare. With that statement, the sun god questioned if his son had in fact used that time to prepare. And the boy answers that he would be ready to descend to the mortal world as soon as his father made his decision. Something that leaves him a little lost, as he didn't know what he was referring to. That is when Vero reveals that his brother had already found the woman destined to succeed the goddess of fire. In fact, he had done it on his first day, as if he already knew her location for some reason. And this shocks his father, who quickly asks how that had happened. A question reinforced by Vero, before he suggests that his beloved goddess Leia had given a map to show the exact location of the ring to her favorite son. This accusation makes the sun god raise his guard, as if his wife would never do that. And with a mocking look, Vero asks if the man in front of him really didn't know about those things, and if he wasn't involved in this scheme. The son's suggestion offends his father, who shouts, asking what he thought he was saying. But the boy kept an irritating calm, explaining that he was debating whether he should reveal the truth to the other 3,000 new immortals and tell them that the winner of that competition had been decided from the beginning. A threat that makes his father bite his lips in disbelief. The boy already prepares to leave, saying that it would be very funny to see the people's reaction to the exciting news, especially when his father and Leia boasted of the neutrality they claimed to have. Hearing all this, the king calls him insolent. But the boy doesn't care, and only asks if his father really couldn't have given up once and for all on that idiot who was his brother. But if he couldn't do it himself, there was no problem, because Vero would do it in his place. In the boy's room, some new immortals called for him, asking why he interrupted the sun god, and arguing that if he had stayed, they could have shown more of Loca's flaws, which could be used in public debates later. They were very confused about that and wanted to know why the master had simply stopped that discussion when it was about to heat up. And one of the girls suggests it was because Vero wanted to win in a fair way and remove any suspicion and distrust people had because he was the first new immortal to claim the throne. One of his fans celebrated so much intelligence, and they insisted that the master confirm those suspicions, since Vero had been silent for quite a while. He must have been enjoying receiving that kind of praise. However, a woman complained, saying that if he kept quiet while all the new immortals fought for him, in the future they wouldn't be able to help him much. And she even warned that if he really wanted to win, he should take advantage of all of them. Wow, she is such a suck-up. The boy finally says something, promising his allies that they would not be disappointed. When one of the girls tries to question him, he interrupts her, saying that there was still one thing they needed to do, and that was to do nothing. Because when the time came, he would take the throne from his father, becoming the next sun god, and he would make sure to give a very good destiny to the old pure-blood immortals. By revealing that eventually they would disappear, the boy shocked his future subjects, who got excited just by the idea of it. Besides that, the boy made it clear that they didn't need to stop messing with humans, as usual. And looking at the photo of Miso, he stated without any doubt that the ring of fire would be in his hands soon. Meanwhile, down below, in the real world, the girl was still on the phone, trying to explain to her boss that she hadn't just skipped work to be with her friends, but to be with her nephew at the hospital. The problem was that this wasn't the first time she had left work like that without telling him, even though she argued that she had worked hard for him for the last 6 months. She argued that firing her because of that would be crazy, but she couldn't even finish her sentence because her incomprehensible boss hung up on her. The girl was frustrated. First, she had had a terrible shift at the restaurant, and now there was this mess at the co-working cafe. She even wondered if the gods themselves had planned all of it. But she couldn't stay complaining for long because Seojin called her and she got up to help him. She entered his room asking what he needed and if he wanted to go to the bathroom, but the boy only pointed to a book and asked her to get it for him. She handed him the Harry Potter book, and he asked her to put it on the bed. And so she did, trying to stay neutral. But that didn't last long, because she soon started poking the boy's face, saying that his nose was really swollen and that it was his best feature, teasing him by asking how Raewon, who was Seojin's crush, would fall in love with him. But the boy quickly cut his aunt off, saying he didn't want to talk about girls with her. That surprised the girl, because she didn't imagine her nephew was actually dating. And she called him rebellious, while commenting that she herself could never be like that. And that made the boy shout, asking why. Then he explained that he considered her a very pretty woman, and she had a good personality. Actually, more like a decent personality, to be honest. But she was funny, and even had a scholarship. So he didn't understand what exactly was missing in Miso for her not to be able to date, until something came to the boy's mind, and he asked if it was because she had to take care of him, asking if he was a burden in his aunt's life. But she quickly told him never to think that way. Changing the subject, Seojin asked if she hadn't been fired again, and asked her to quit those part-time jobs already, which left the protagonist in disbelief. The boy went on explaining that the life insurance his parents left was more than enough for them to live a comfortable life. Sometimes the maturity of that boy scares me. Then he asked why his aunt was making her life so much harder, especially because with the scholarship she received, she wouldn't even have to worry about paying for college. And the woman tried to find words to answer that. It was like sitting in front of an analyst. To finish breaking her down, Seojin tells her to take a good look in the mirror and reflect on her situation. After all, he had heard everything they told Miso at the center, and apparently she needed more help than he did. That was the last straw for the woman to scold him. shouting at that boy and asking how he could say those things to his own aunt. But Seojin replies that she deserved to hear the truth. Stressed, she gets ready to leave the room, saying that if he kept that attitude, she would abandon him for good. But like any stubborn 7-year-old child, Seojin shouts that she could go. After all, he didn't need Miso or her help. He was even already managing to read the untranslated version of that book. She even thinks of something to say back, but nothing would match the argument of her 7-year-old nephew with an IQ of 150. So she leaves through the door, fuming. She sits in the same place as before, outraged by that situation. It wasn't possible that her nephew had nothing better to do than put his own aunt down. She was so irritated that if Seojin wasn't already hospitalized there, she would put him in as a patient. Running her hand over her face, where earlier there had been a wound, a click wakes her up to something. Miso remembers that earlier, Loca said she should be healed of all wounds. And she wonders if that spell could also help her nephew. When she turns to look for that irritating boy, she finds Loca right behind her chair, staying in the same awkward silence as usual before shouting, wanting to know what the hell he was doing there. But the god covers his ears, asking why she was shouting. After all, it was Miso who had called him. Trying to calm down, the girl asks for the 30th time if the boy in front of her really was a god. He had no patience left and asks if she never listened to a word he said. Besides, he wanted to know why she wasn't at work, because if Miso didn't go, he didn't need to go either. Looking at that guy, the protagonist wondered how a god could look so sloppy, offending the boy. After all, he could read minds, and that was something she wasn't used to. Trying to change the subject, she runs off and pulls the boy's arm, telling him to follow her. The two go to Seojin's room, who stares at that man seriously. And Loca does the same, arms crossed and with his usual bad mood. Trying to break the silence, the little boy asks who that was, and his aunt explains that the man was there to fix him. And she whispers to Loca that since he did that the day before, he could do the same thing, but he didn't understand what she was suggesting. So she says he had to do that thing he did before, saying a bunch of words and making her wounds disappear. Now she wanted him to do it for her nephew. The boy was indignant that she called his divine abilities that thing. But the woman tries to divert the conversation, saying that if he fixed Seojin, she would give in and treat Loca as the god he claimed to be. And such a proposal makes a smile open at the corner of the boy's lips, who gets closer to the little boy, saying he shouldn't make that a habit. Seojin finally remembers Loca's face and asks his aunt if that wasn't the guy who hit her when they went to visit his mother's ashes, and asks if the police were the ones who brought him to the hospital. But the god quickly interrupts, saying the boy had understood it all wrong and that actually it was his aunt who hit him. When the poor boy goes to mention Miso's hand, which was hurt, he is interrupted by the boy who tells him to be quiet, hugging him and explaining that soon he would bring a miracle to the boy's life. And stroking his hair, he says he would give him his blessing. Using the same spell as the day before, Loca recites that all pain should disappear and that the boy would be healed of all wounds. Nervous, Miso asks if he had already finished his work, and the boy turns to her, saying that if she didn't mind, he would like to keep his act just between them. After all, if other people knew about his healing ability, he would be bombarded with requests all day. But the woman doesn't even listen to what the boy has to say, running toward her nephew, to know what was wrong with his face. And that catches the god's attention, who didn't know what she was talking about. Then the girl shouts, asking why the little boy's face was still the same as before. Hearing that, Loca gets closer to the boy, upset, and questions how the kid had not been healed, certain that there was some misunderstanding. Then he grabs Seojin's shoulders, saying they would try one more time. But the boy asks what was wrong with Loca. That's when Miso steps in, telling him to stop, pushing the guy away from her precious nephew. She asks everyone to calm down and for the two of them to continue that conversation outside the hospital room, while Seojin stared at the man, now sure he was a lunatic. Scared, she pulls him into the hallway, near the stairs in a quieter area. She was clearly uneasy, thinking about how she would arrange her words so that man wouldn't snap. Miso sighs, apologizing for calling Loca to help the boy. But she cuts herself off, saying she hadn't really called him. Actually, she had only thought of him, but that didn't matter. Then she explained that her nephew was everything she had, and that's why she was so careful with the boy. So she assured him that she would pay for everything he had done for the two of them. However, she needed him to leave, and the god didn't think twice before agreeing to her request. He was too embarrassed to do anything different. He goes to the bathroom trying to see if he was still sane and if that was really happening, staring at his hands over the sink. He closes them, trying to use his power to open the faucet, but without any success. Loca looks at his own hands, getting desperate. He wondered what had happened for his powers to vanish. And he calls for Hyunjae, because he needed help to know what to do with this new situation. But before he can finish this call, someone enters the bathroom asking if the boy couldn't control his own powers without his servant's help, which leaves the boy uneasy. The man who entered comments how pathetic Loca was because of that. It was his brother Vero, unfortunately, who makes a point of saying it was impressive to see him standing so early because of a girl. Loca's expression turns into an ironic smile, and he questions how the redhead found that place so fast, because apparently he was smarter than he thought. But the boy denies it, reminding him and revealing that he knew his brother had found that place using the navigation system the goddess Leia handed over to him. And getting closer to the god of light, he explains that he only followed him. That was a surprise for Loca, who stutters while asking if Leia was the one responsible for giving the system into Hyunjae's hands, something confirmed by Vero, who can't help but add that because of this, the boy was screwed. But that last bit catches him off guard, and Loca asks why he would be screwed like that. Then his brother explains that, as he must have noticed earlier, now he couldn't use his powers for anything. From that moment on, he would have to live like any other human and win Miso over that way. Earlier, when he revealed to his father that his brother was cheating, the old man told him to shut his mouth, questioning Vero about what his real intentions were with that report. Ironically, the boy acted like a rebellious teenager, commenting that his father had even more generosity than he thought. And then he asked if the man would make him his successor immediately. But that sounded like an absurd idea. And his face makes the god laugh, commenting that he didn't need to be so surprised. After all, he knew his father well and knew how he felt about the appointment for the last 200 years. However, what he was asking there was something very simple and even fair. He wanted a fair competition between brothers. Hearing this, the sun god says that in that case, the question to ask was different. And then he asks what Vero wanted from him. And that's how the boy managed to get exactly where his brother was on Earth. However, the god didn't simply abandon him there, but sent one of his subordinates to keep an eye on the boy 24 hours a day. He knew Vero well enough to know he would try to hurt his own brother because he was capable of anything. The king scolds Hyunjae, commenting that restricting Loca's powers was a punishment for him playing with magic without responsibility. However, he questions Hyunjae about how he could have been so careless with the navigation he had received. But the boy argues, saying he never told anyone about it. Regardless of whether he told or not, this had caused a headache for the sun god, who now had no choice but to guarantee whatever his other son asked, even though he still hadn't revealed what that would be. The subordinate looked at him worried, not really knowing what to think about his fate, while the king firmly stated that Vero would hide his true desire until the very last moment. Desperate, the servant asks what would happen to Loca in this scenario, but the sun god makes it clear that he hadn't left his son completely powerless. He just made sure to reduce his powers so that he could only protect himself. And that was something not even Vero could change. Hyunjae asks what exactly was enough power, and his master replies that the boy would soon find out what that meant. But for that, Hyunjae needed to have a little faith in him, something the boy apparently didn't have, even though he answered that he would try his best. In the middle of all that confusion, Leia enters the room of her beloved, asking how he could do that to his own son. She was very angry and shouted to ask how the man could punish him in such a harsh way. After all, he had not even done anything. Now he had sent the boy to a mortal world he did not even know, with no power. The man comforts her, saying he knew how important Loca was to the woman, but this time she had gone too far. Even with that explanation, Leia did not understand. That's when the man asked if she had given the navigation system to their son, which makes the woman's eyes widen. With no answer, the sun god insists, and her silence is already a confirmation. Then the man holds his beloved's hand, saying that Loca was his son and therefore would be able to get through anything. He embraces her, asking her not to worry, because the boy would be fine on his own, which was a reality quite far away, considering the face he was making after that little scene in the bathroom with his brother. He was simply sitting in the middle of the street looking so down that some people passing by wondered why such a handsome guy was sitting on the ground, thinking maybe he had been dumped or something like that. Alone, he kept repeating like a madman that this could not be real, and he could not have just lost his powers like that. That's when someone approached to ask if he was okay. The kind old man asked if he was there at the hospital for a funeral or something and insisted that Loca answer. When he finally noticed there was someone at his side, he mumbled, and the old man explained that he had asked what he was doing there, and if he had someone he knew who was sick, whether his mother or father. But still, he says that a young man like him should not be lying around sad like that. After all, he could not lose hope. And the kind old man argues that this hospital was actually very good. All Loca answers is, "My form," and this leaves the guard a little confused, until the boy suddenly stands up, shouting to the winds that only the most sacred men could see his original form. He kept repeating, "Most sacred man," with force, and the guard thought at least he had found out the boy's body was fine. In disbelief, Loca questions if that old man could really see him, which the man confirms, asking if he needed a psychiatric evaluation or something like that. But he does not care about that last part, only with the fact that his doubts were now confirmed that he was without power. The boy turns around looking for something he could test his powers on and finds a post, walking toward it. The boy points, starting his spell to put light where there was darkness before. He looked like a madman pointing at the lamp when a crowd of curious people gathered around the situation, and even the guard had to call for extra security to see what was wrong with Loca. The boy trembled because his spell had done nothing, which meant he could not even control simple lights. Until someone shouts, celebrating that they had found the god, who was too busy being shocked with his new limitations. Yoonjae runs to reach him, calling him little brother, and explaining to the people that his brother was not doing very well in the head, making them feel sympathy for the situation and also asking to take care of Loca because he did not seem well, and that road was very busy, so it could be dangerous. Something Hyunjae thanks for, pulling his master who only knew how to scream, asking what was happening with his divinity. Meanwhile, in Seojin's room, Miso was resting beside the bed, until a nurse entered the room, explaining that she needed to examine the boy. However, the protagonist explains that the doctor had already gone to visit, but the girl confirms that Miso's nephew was also receiving psychiatric treatment, since he had a new doctor taking care of that part. The doctor introduces himself, asking if the lady was Seojin's legal guardian, something she confirms, a bit uneasy with that presence, and the man says he was excited to work with her nephew, because he would take care of Seojin from then on. And even though he was a god, Vero introduces himself only as a doctor, Nam. The girl stared at that boy, by the way, very handsome with a lost look. He walks past her, going toward Seojin, checking his injured mouth. But he smiles when he sees that the damage to his teeth and the skin inside his mouth was almost minimal. And he acted as if he was surrounded by children all the time up there, saying that his cheeks must be really sore and making a sound imitating that pain, feeling sorry for the child because that must have hurt a lot. He turns to Miso and says that even with constant medication, burns of that degree usually took about 6 months to heal completely. Noticing how deep in thought the woman was, he asks if she was listening, which the protagonist confirms, even though it was a big lie. And he stands up, remembering there was one small detail he forgot to mention. Looking at the boy's hospital chart, he explains that although patient care was essential, that specific hospital made sure to also provide emotional support for their guardians. This leaves Miso a bit shocked. She had gone to that hospital for many years and had never heard of anything like that. So the man explains that wounds could heal completely with their care, but that did not mean they could simply neglect the well-being of the people present there. That is something the girl agrees with without even questioning. And she also explains that her nephew was very mature for his age. However, Vero comes closer with a kind smile and says that he was actually referring to the woman in front of him. Seojin just watched that silly interaction without saying a word, but he noticed that his aunt's face was red like a tomato. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, poor Yoonjae was being pressed against a wall, being scared by his superior, who says the boy surely knew something. The servant stuttered. He could not say a word because his master was already yelling, asking if it was true that he had lost all his powers and wanted to know exactly how that happened. Even if the boy's silence lasted only milliseconds, the god was desperate and shouted for him to say something because he needed to know if he had really lost his powers. A few minutes later, after the boy explained the situation properly, the god of light screamed. He was freaking out because all of that had been caused by some resentful ones who could not accept a small thing like using his powers to get an advantage in the competition. After all, he had not done anything serious. What were 5 seconds of world peace? He did not even let Hyunjae say anything and ran out shouting, asking how that could have happened and what kind of god was stopped from using his own powers. He could not believe that was happening, and even if it was useless, he tried to think of what he could do to reverse that situation on his own. However, Hyunjae had not finished with the divine warnings and quickly ripped off the band-aid to tell his master that the navigation system he had received from Goddess Leia was not working properly. That managed to make the boy even more irritated, and he grumbled, saying he had not even asked for help in the first place, and that was definitely not fair. His servant says he understood how he felt, but it would be better to accept the situation and quickly come up with a plan to continue in the competition without more problems. But Loca shouts, asking how he could do that without his powers. After all, what was a god without them? But that only gave the boy more reason to argue that they needed to think of something. And that makes the boy even more stressed, asking what they were supposed to think of after a tragedy like that. Hyunjae was already tired. He definitely was not paid well enough to put up with that kind of thing. In the worst mood possible, he grabs his master by the shoulders, making it clear that his powers did not define him, and if he was really a god, he should start acting like one, leaving the spoiled boy outraged, asking how he dared talk to a god like that, which makes the boy ask if now he had decided he was a god, because he was not acting like one. And it was too much insolence for Loca, who thought about annoying his servant. Ignoring the boy's bad temper, Hyunjae explains that at that moment, it was more important than anything else that the master did not let Miso leave his side. Not even for a second. And the boy goes back to complaining, saying that he needed to see his father immediately, which surprises Hyunjae a little, who argues that since he came down to that world, he already knew he would not be able to meet his father until he completed his mission. Even so, the boy kept denying it, even though the truth was right in front of his face. He could not believe that all of that was really happening to him. Then the servant went up again with the point that their only hope now was Miso, which made the boy's face even darker. Speaking of Miso, she was with the fake doctor who explained that her nephew's burns had not been very severe, but he had noticed from the history that he had already received psychiatric treatment. The girl shivered at this statement, trying to explain the reason for the treatment. Realizing that she was getting lost in words, the boy explained that she did not need to explain, because the hospital itself kept the reports. And she agreed as if she was no longer paying attention. Friendly, he explained that he would resume the psychiatric treatment after he noticed some improvement in the boy's burns. And then he said goodbye to the woman with a smile, leaving only her and Seojin in the room. The little boy couldn't help but comment on how handsome the man was, and the protagonist agreed, even questioning how someone that handsome could be human. And she still complained, because the guys she knew at the co-working cafe weren't anything like him. That's when the two entered the room, already ruining what was left of Miso's good mood. She screamed, asking what that guy wanted to be back there for, and Hyunjae was the one who answered, saying that they had a little something they needed to tell her. But Loca couldn't help but notice a very irritating detail. His brother, who was now walking down the hallways with a huge lab coat, had been with the girl he needed to win over. And Loca looked at him like someone coming out of a funeral. Trying to ignore this, he turned back to Miso again, who was too busy screaming, saying that they couldn't just invade the room like that, but his servant was taking care of the situation, asking her to calm down so they could talk like civilized people. Trying to calm down, the girl explained that she knew she owed Loca a big favor and wanted to be able to talk, but at that moment she was in no condition to do so. Pulling his master, Hyunjae asked why, suggesting that she was sick or something like that. Before she could explain, Miso's cell phone vibrated in her pocket. She answered, apologizing and explaining to the person on the other end that she would call back as soon as possible. It was her boss demanding her presence, and the protagonist explained that she couldn't go at that moment because something unexpected had happened. She looked at Seojin and his weakened state and apologized again, saying that she couldn't go. However, the girl thought for a moment. She was already ready to leave, asking her boss to wait just a moment for her to arrive at work. When she ended up tripping over Loca's foot, she would have hit the floor hard if it weren't for the boy's quick reflexes that startled him, pulling her hand to try to hold her. However, this small act made the two of them disappear into a mist that hovered over the room. Only Seojin was left there, shocked by what had happened, just like Hyunjae, who immediately shouted for his master. Meanwhile, in the hallways, Vero turned, hearing all that commotion, curious about what might have caused it. They both fell abruptly to the floor, with Miso leaning against the boy's chest. And when she realized the situation she was in, she was outraged. The protagonist leaned against Loca's chest and screamed to ask what he thought he was doing with her, until the woman who had been talking to Miso on the phone earlier entered the room, saying it would be better if she just quit right away. However, that scene of the two of them caught the woman so off guard that she couldn't even figure out what she was saying. And then she called the name of her subordinate who, nervous, answered that she was there. That left the woman very confused. After all, the girl had just said that she couldn't be present. Besides, the woman asked if that was Maud lying on the floor. Miso quickly got up, trying to explain why the boy was in that position without making the situation even stranger. But she ended up getting lost in words, so she decided to hurry and go straight to her work things, apologizing again for being late and running to change. Meanwhile, the poor guy was still on the floor, looking like he had been run over by a bus. At least until the woman asked if the two of them were having an affair, because that question was enough for him to get up angry, shouting that the woman shouldn't suggest impossible things like that. While Miso also denied it. Their tone stresses the coworker, who asked them to calm down because there was no need to keep shouting. It had only been a question. And taking advantage of the fact that the girl was there, she calls her for a private conversation, which Miso has no choice but to accept. The two sit alone at a table in the cafe that was still empty. The woman wanted to suggest that her employee take a break at least for a while. The problem for Miso is that she couldn't do that because she had been fired from her other jobs for missing a few days. And she argues that the woman knew her well enough to know that she needed to keep working. Sighing, not knowing what to do exactly, the woman reaffirms that she knew this better than anyone. Even so, she wanted to know if the protagonist didn't think that taking care of her nephew, studying and focusing on a part-time job wasn't something impossible. And that word brings terror to Miso's face, who almost chokes on the air. Continuing the subject, the woman asks why Miso doesn't go back to the hospital for now. At least not to leave Seojin alone. And the mention of him makes Miso jump. Being honest, her boss questions what the boy had done in past lives to be paying such a high price in this one, and reveals that she felt bad for the girl, who takes advantage of this to ask her to be more understanding with some matters in this case. After all, the payment there was very good, and being in that job was the only thing that guaranteed the protagonist could buy some books for her nephew. Customers suddenly start arriving, catching the woman's attention. And then she gets up ready to attend to them and makes it clear that they could talk better when Seojin left the hospital, confirming with Miso, who seemed extremely disappointed with herself. She sighs and Loca watches her from afar, sad like that. He couldn't get out of his head that she and Hera were very different. Flashes of the past life, of his old beloved, come to his mind. Of when Hera was adored, constantly called by the cameras. The woman smiled, waving like a true miss. But now he was stuck with that depressed girl full of problems. The girl was sitting at the bus stop, waiting to return to the hospital to see Seojin. And Loca tried to keep a certain distance. It was as if he felt sorry for the girl, because she was the reincarnation of his love, and her life was very sad. Meanwhile, Miso focused on more anxious thoughts, wondering how she would pay for her nephew's center and daycare if she got fired. She even considered talking to Seojin himself and explaining that she had been scammed and therefore couldn't pay for anything at that moment. Yes, it had only been 6 months, and she had already managed to lose all 3 of her part-time jobs. Something that happened every time she had some problem with her nephew. Trying to hold back tears, she wonders what she would do to solve it this time. But she also lamented, because she didn't know what she had done to have such an unlucky life, feeling unmotivated to even keep living. But she inevitably fell into that thought, and as bad as it may seem, the girl wished she had gone to heaven with her brother. But Loca approaches with crossed arms, questioning if she really thought heaven was all that. His voice scares her. She had forgotten that the supposed God could read her mind. And he continues, explaining that if someone like her went to heaven, she would be kept as a slave for at least 300 years. She didn't know if that was an insult or if he was being serious, but still it was bizarre. Then the guy tries to be more explanatory and asks if she knew that when a human died, they went to hell or to heaven, and that when humans went to heaven, things were not exactly peaceful and paradisiacal, like the book said. In reality, they became God's servants, exactly like him. Or better, a slave, if you want to call it that. This information left the girl a little shocked, but the boy continues, questioning if the protagonist knew why so many humans chose to return to the mortal world. And he doesn't even wait for the girl to answer and already states that no matter how bad their life was down here, because it was certainly better than the life they would have in the supposed heaven. That's why they preferred to reincarnate. Distancing herself from the boy, the girl complains, saying that he was too much for her head now. And she still wasn't even sure if he was really a god or not, but she was certain he didn't have the slightest sense. Stressed, Loca says that life was a matter of retribution, emphasizing that word, and asking if she knew what that meant. But the boy counters, questioning if all the people in the world had a life as difficult as hers. And soon Miso denies it. But it wasn't all black and white like that. That's when she realized something. Interrupting her speech, she states that she had only mentioned that story of heaven in her head, and then asks if the boy was reading her mind again, and he tries to hide it. The girl jumps on top of the boy, asking if being a god gave him the right to invade her thoughts. But Loca explains that it wasn't like he could simply avoid it. But all that scolding made him realize something very important. He had read Miso's thoughts. Therefore, he managed to use his powers. The girl gets confused for a moment before remembering that besides that, they had teleported to that cafe, which caught her by surprise. A psychopathic smile forms on Loca's face, just with the possibility that his brother had lied to him earlier. Then he closes his eyes, determined to use his abilities and take them to his sanctuary without any help. However, he only looks like a lunatic at the bus stop, because nothing happens. An awkward silence hangs in the air, while Miso holds herself back from laughing at that boy. She asks what exactly he was trying to do, but the boy comes back with his indignant pose, questioning why it wasn't working. He didn't know what was different now. After all, as the girl herself said, he had managed to teleport earlier. So what could be missing? So he repeats his pose, trying again to teleport to his sanctuary, while Miso pretends she doesn't know that lunatic. Finally, her bus arrives. However, before she could cross, a motorcycle quickly passes by the girl. She jumps in fear after almost dying, and that scare makes her stumble. She was about to fall straight toward the bus, and maybe it wouldn't stop soon enough. Her scream catches Loca's attention, who was still trying to cast spells, and he runs to help the girl, pulling her right at the moment she would be hit by the vehicle. The two intertwine their hands, and an overwhelming feeling takes over their bodies, leaving them both confused. And consequently, the scene shifts from there, exactly like earlier. The driver is shocked, wondering what had happened. When he gets out of the bus, the adults had disappeared, but he was sure he had seen the girl just a step away seconds before. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Seojin was having fun doing math problems with Hyunjae, commenting that his aunt didn't know how to multiply big numbers in her head. Now it was the adults' turn to challenge him. However, they were covered by a mysterious fog, just like earlier. When it clears a little, Hyunjae looks down, not believing what he is seeing. Just like the little boy. They scream when they see their master Loca and his aunt Miso, respectively, fallen on the floor, as if they had just appeared there. When Loca realizes what he did, he jumps with joy, excited because it worked again, and he managed to use his powers. Even Miso celebrates, saying that it was an incredible and very convenient ability, to be honest. Poking her, the girl recognizes that he really was a god. That was very interesting. However, cutting their fun short, Hyunjae approaches asking what had happened, and Seojin follows, wanting to know where she had gone and if she had used magic or something like that to get there. Noticing that the god of light was silent, his servant called his attention without receiving any response. At least until the boy decides to pull the servant by the arm, saying they needed to talk. He takes the guy to another spot in the hospital, pinning him against the wall as usual, and then states that he had used his powers. And all that closeness made Hyunjae stutter when asking how he had done that. The thing is that Loca couldn't be sure. So Hyunjae argues that the sun god had specifically told him that he left the sun only with enough powers to protect himself, and that the boy would soon discover the meaning of that. Those words make Loca remember all the events involving his powers in the last day. He was quiet like a statue when Hyunjae decides to get closer, lightly touching his shoulder, and asking him to take a deep breath and say exactly what had happened before he managed to use the powers, with all the details. After all the explanation, Hyunjae decides to retrace his master's steps, putting himself in Loca's place. Somehow he had grabbed the protagonist like that, and pulled her in a specific way. That whole situation was at least embarrassing, especially considering that the two were basically hugging in the middle of the hospital corridor with several people watching. But Hyunjae was very focused on knowing if that was how they had teleported to that place to check. Unlike Loca, who as soon as he noticed the presence of more people around, changed his behavior, shouting and pushing his servant to get him away quickly. The boy's posture surprises Hyunjae, who questions if he couldn't use the powers at that moment, because he thought that keeping physical contact with the boy would be enough. Protecting himself from that pushy one, Loca says that if he still had all his powers, he would surely use them to get rid of the boy once and for all. Realizing that just physical contact wasn't enough to use his abilities, Hyunjae suggests that maybe he had to do that with Miso. which makes Loca thoughtful. He closes his eyes to focus, remembering that Miso had commented that she would have to talk to Seojin about losing all her part-time jobs. News that would surely stress the boy even more. Inside the room, the two were still talking about Hyunjae, since Miso worried if the boy had taken good care of her nephew. But for him, everything was fine. After all, he was a smart man and even beat him in a math game. Loca knew that Miso's biggest concern was the conversation with her nephew. He had come to that conclusion after reading the girl's mind at the bus stop. Noticing that his master was somewhat absent from the conversation, Hyunji calls his attention, and the god sighs, saying that he thought he knew what he needed to use his powers. Meanwhile, in one of the hospital rooms, Vero continued with his doctor pose, until some shining butterflies enter the room, materializing an elegant woman. It was his maid who arrived behind him in human clothes, hugging him. However, the boy was not welcoming at all, complaining to her that he had asked her to stay alert and quiet until she was summoned. Ignoring the harsh tone, the girl asks if Vero found the destined girl, something he confirms with the same angry pose. And that Julia can't let pass, asking if, by any chance, her presence bothered him. Without answering directly, the boy pulls her by the shoulders, questioning what she was doing there in the mortal world. To which the girl responds that she was afraid her master would fall in love with the girl again. All that drama gave the boy a headache, and he soon grumbles. Turning his back to Julia again, he tells her to go back to heaven if she only came there to talk that kind of nonsense. His behavior leaves the girl desperate, and she begs him not to send her away. Throwing herself to her knees in front of the boy and asking forgiveness insistently, swearing never to talk about that incident again. That scene was pathetic to say the least. But he couldn't make it that obvious to Julia, at least not now. So he calls her gently. Bending down in front of the girl, he asks why after so many proofs of trust and faith she gave him, she kept tormenting herself with something that happened 20 years ago. The affection in his voice makes the girl forget all the rudeness she had to endure since she arrived. And the man returns to a serious pose, telling the girl to meet with the humans as he instructed, because they would be waiting for her. And in a caring gesture, though false, he strokes the girl's face. Julia goes into a trance with that, accepting anything her master ordered for crumbs of affection. Meanwhile, in the hospital room, Miso tried to cheer Seojin, asking if he wanted to read a book or play a game. But the boy didn't seem excited, until the most annoying duo in history entered the room. And Hyunjae shouts for Seojin, who apparently had become his new best friend, even though he was just a 7-year-old boy. The boy was already calling him uncle, and his face lights up, asking where he had been all this time. Miso, on the other hand, was outraged that her nephew was so happy to see the guy. The two talked as if they were in their own little world, and Hyunjae treated Seojin with great affection, asking if he wanted some candy, a book, ready to give anything to the boy who only asked for watermelon. Miso watches everything, outraged, asking what the hell was happening there, until Loca calls her attention. And seriously, he explains that they need to talk. They return to the terrace to discuss in private. She remembered very well what had happened the last time they were there, so she asks what he wanted now. The boy was serious, and kind of unsure how to deliver such delicate news, because some time ago, when he talked with Hyunjae, he was shocked at the fact that his master and Miso would have to have physical contact for his powers to work. An awkward silence lingered in the room after that discovery, and after reflecting a bit, Hyunjae concluded that it wasn't such a big deal. They just needed to stay focused on the purpose. And Loca also comforted him, saying that they would manage to fulfill the mission. But now, in front of Miso, he sighed. He explains that he would prefer to be more polite and less aggressive about all that. But the circumstances had changed a lot. And those mentions without saying the main subject made Miso even more confused. He pulls the girl by the shoulders and explains that the two of them needed to live together. The protagonist seems to try to process that information for a while without showing a reaction, until her face is taken over by unimaginable horror, making her scream at the slightest suggestion that the two would have to share the same space. Flashbacks of the earlier conversation come to mind, and Hyunjae recaps the action plan, explaining that first they needed to get the fire ring, and to do that Miso needed to remember her past life. Loca agrees with all that information, making Hyunjae continue his line of thought, saying that there was only one solution, because the best way to see the girl's past life memories was if Loca was close to her when the protagonist slept. And since that usually happened at night, the poor guy couldn't even finish the reasoning, because Loca starts shouting, asking what he was suggesting, and if the two would have to sleep together. But Hyunjae remains calm, explaining that maybe he didn't actually have to sleep with her. But if he wanted to see past memories, mortals usually recalled them when they were sleeping. And he also makes it clear that they only had to do it this way because he wasn't with all his normal powers. The problem was that the god knew the girl would hate this proposal. So he asks what he should do in this situation, to which Hyunjae answers that since the god's powers were tied to the protagonist, they could make a deal. And that gives the boy a great idea, because judging by Seojin's reaction, his powers had impressed him a lot. And Hyunjae admits it had been a great idea. The problem was that now he was facing Miso, who was trembling while trying to find the right insult to throw at the god. Even so, he was extremely calm, explaining that he expected this reaction, he just thought she would get over it faster. Waving his hand in front of the girl's face to see if she woke up. But she slaps his hand, telling him to stop that, and then asks how he even dared to propose something like that. Living together was something very serious, and she suspected there was more behind it. Seriously, he asks if the girl wasn't worried about losing her job at the cafe, something that until a moment ago she had even forgotten, since she was so worried about her nephew. And getting closer, Loca explains that he could help, if he lived with her. But the girl was stubborn and turns her back, asking if that was the best Loca could do. After all, getting another part-time job was an easy task for her, and she didn't need help. Then the boy reminds her of a very important time mark, 6 months. And that mention is enough to make the girl tremble. He goes back to his thoughts on the bus, saying that every time her nephew got sick, Miso was fired. And because of that, the longest she managed to keep a job was 6 months. Besides, she had lost her sister's life insurance because of her bad decisions. And after using the last money she had on food, she must have had about 10,000 to survive for who knows how long. The fact that he knew all that scares the girl, and she asks how he had access to that information. That's when Loca asks if she really didn't notice that she kept counting the money she had in her head. And that revelation shocks Miso. For him, the surprising thing was that Seojin didn't know any of that, and still argued with his aunt to quit her jobs once and for all. The god makes a point of saying that the protagonist had a golden nephew, and in some ways he was even more mature than her. Thinking carefully about the direction of the conversation, the girl asks if that guy was really trying to buy her with money. And the accusation makes the boy's eyes widen. He grabs her arm violently, outraged that some human dared talk to his divinity that way, and makes it clear that he was only taking advantage of what Miso thought was most important, which was her money and consequently her jobs. He shouts that was all the girl had, and he wanted to help her with that, even though he said those words in a harsh and superior tone. Still, when she pulls away from the boy, she tries to argue, saying that just suggesting living together with someone you had just met was kind of absurd. However, Loca explains that nothing big would happen. He just had to finish his mission quickly, and all he needed to do was watch the girl sleep, something he probably shouldn't have revealed to her since she was very offended. Even so, he keeps saying it's not like he wanted to do that kind of thing in the first place. But that's how things were. Before he could finish his sentence, the girl gives in, saying that she didn't care and just wanted him to stay away from her. After all, ever since they met, the boy only brought problems and more problems. And she was tired. So Miso turns her back. Loca even thinks about stopping her to talk with her, but is left there alone before he can do anything. He was extremely angry, and he didn't know why that kind of thing kept happening to a god anyway. In the hospital room, everything was perfect. Hyunjae enjoyed his lack of anxiety. He celebrates the snack, surprised that Hyunjae really brought it. But the boy explains that he would never leave his precious Sandrino hanging. A curiosity hits the boy, and he decides to ask why his uncle Hyunjae was always with him. He wanted to know if he didn't have to go home or something like that. But the man explains that he had been sent there to spend time with Seojin, so he would stay by his side, for as long as the boy wanted. Suddenly, the boy lowers his head, saying that man was a liar because no one could stay for that long. And even his aunt left him alone to go work. And holding one of his magic cubes, he explains that it was fine because he could entertain himself. He had books and games on his phone. Hearing a child say that leaves Hyunjae shocked. It was at least depressing that Seojin had to take care of himself so soon. And touching his hand to take the cube, he explains that the boy was right, because he really was good at keeping himself busy and entertained. But he bet it was more fun than a phone. After all, smart kids like Seojin needed someone even smarter to have fun with and to talk to. The little boy mocks, asking if Hyunjae really meant to say that he was smarter. And the man answers that of course he was. because even if it didn't look like it, he was 130 years old. That really surprises Seojin, who didn't know how the man had reached that age with the same face as his aunt. And Hyunji tells him not to judge a book by its cover like that, having fun with the boy. But the fun mood ends when his aunt enters the room slamming the door. The servant stands up excited, but the woman wasn't in the mood for big talks and just tells him to leave immediately. Seojin protests, and Hyunjae asks if she had talked with Maud about the matter, correcting his name for almost calling him Loca. But the girl yells, saying she didn't care what the man's real name was, she just wanted him to leave the room right away, leaving an awkward silence in the air. Before the man leaves, Seojin asks why his aunt was yelling at his new friend, since they had had a lot of fun that day. But for her, that didn't matter. After all, they barely knew those two guys. And turning to her nephew, she is harsh when asking when he had ever had fun with anyone else. That really catches him off guard, leaving him completely shocked. Reinforcing her earlier request, the woman tells Hyunjae to leave right away. And she points, adding one more thing. She wanted him to take that psychotic god, or whatever Loca was, along with him, out of the hospital. As soon as they leave the room, the woman sits in the chair for companions and grumbles, making Seojin ask what was wrong. But she didn't want him to tell her. For now, she just wanted to enjoy the silence. In the hallway, Hyunjae wanted to know what had happened in the conversation between the two, while Vero watched his brother leaving the hospital, with a cynical smile on his face, as if it was already proof that he had won the competition. Vero was very happy seeing his brother's supposed defeat. After being kicked out of the room, Hyunjae asks his boss to explain exactly what had happened, to which he answers, with no patience at all, that he had been expelled once and for all from the girl's life. That insolent answer makes the servant lose patience, realizing his master was in spoiled teenager mode. Stressed, the servant vents, asking if the boy really couldn't make even a small effort to help their situation, commenting that it was clear to him that the boy had never had to work for anything in his life. And those comments leave Loca outraged. Even so, Hyunjae keeps saying that his boss had no idea how hard things were for humans. After all, he had spent his whole life up there in paradise as a god, which meant he had never faced any difficulty. And when he asked if he was wrong, he got silence from the boy, at least until he gave him a cynical laugh, repeating his words. No difficulties at all, right? That conversation brings up unpleasant memories for the god. From when he was asking for help, he was still a child and begged for them to open the door because he was locked in a room alone. On the other side, he heard someone say that he needed to be strong, surprising him. His father was on the other side, explaining that since he was his son, he needed to go through that ritual, even though it was a hard task. And the little boy, in the middle of his tears, tries to argue. Even so, his father is firm when saying that if he let the shadows and fear take over, then he didn't deserve to be a god. Even terrified, the little boy agrees. It's not like he had another choice, to be honest. He is woken from his thoughts by Hyunjae, who explains that he understood that whole situation, and that as soon as he became the god of the sun, he would indeed rule over everything and everyone. Being ironic, the boy thanks his servant for the support and understanding. Tired, Hyunjae sits down, asking if the boy knew why he had freely chosen to serve Loca for the next century, even if in the last 20 years the boy hadn't shown himself to be anything better than an unbearable drunk. Before Loca answers, the man explains that it was because his master was strangely human, which draws a little of the god's attention. And he keeps explaining that it was funny because even when he was making trouble, he seemed more human than the humans themselves. And he reveals that it was exactly for that reason that he wanted Loca to become the god of the sun, explaining that maybe that way, but just maybe, humans would find some relief in their lives marked by such hard situations. Loca was shocked by those words, while Hyunjae turned to the boy with a kind and honest smile, maybe for the first time since the two started living together. Trying to change the subject and not fall into an even more sentimental mood, Loca forces a cough, asking where the two of them would sleep that night. After all, they had been permanently kicked out of the hospital, and the god states that his sanctuary on Earth had probably already disappeared by now. Since the servant says nothing, the boy keeps insisting, waiting for an answer. But all Hyunjae does is burst into laughter, even though he had tried to hold it back at all costs. After all, there was no way he could know the next plan because he expected his master to have some sense and not fail the simplest mission possible. With night falling at the hospital, things seemed calmer for the protagonist. She rested in a chair next to her nephew's bed, who by this point had already fallen asleep. Suddenly, Vero opens the door, careful not to make too much noise. When he enters the room, he finds Miso fast asleep and stares at her thoughtfully. Careful, he approaches, giving a small touch on the girl's head. That touch was enough for him to access her past life memories, when she was in fact Hera, even though she couldn't remember her name. That takes him to a very specific memory, when he was face to face with the woman, still wearing his god's clothes. He took the woman's hand as if it was the most precious thing in the world. That moment had passed and was distant in the girl's memory, but this memory was enough. And Vero steps back, satisfied, giving a malicious smile with the confirmation of who that girl really was. And before leaving, he wishes sweet dreams to our girl, referring to her as Hera. The next day, the woman was alone with her nephew in the room, sharing a meal. And she confirms that he had already finished so she could take his tray, which Seojin thanks her for. But soon she is caught by surprise by her phone vibrating, something that at this point shouldn't even be a surprise anymore, since the girl kept getting calls from her bosses. But this time, who wanted to talk to her was Seojin's school. And the girl stumbles over the subject, asking them to wait a little, before she could leave the room, asking them to continue, when she realized that the subject was his own absence. She explained that next week the boy would already be back. However, the school was more worried about something else, which was the money for the afternoon shift he attended, and new uniforms, something that Miso says she would like to register again for next semester. She was already giving her word that she would send the money at the end of the month, when a nurse appeared asking if she was Seojin's legal guardian, and informing her that she had to settle the hospital bill still by the end of the day. That mention of money makes Miso nervous. Even so, she assures the school she would make the payments later, and then hangs up. The woman sighs, exhausted. She had many things to pay and probably no money for it. That's when she noticed a very important detail in the hospital halls. Loca and Hyunjae were still there, in a humiliating scene, sleeping on chairs in the middle of the hallway. And some patients whispered that the two had been there for a few days, saying that the fact they managed to sleep like that without worrying about the rest was quite impressive. Although other patients felt a little pity. After all, they didn't know the real reasons those guys were there. So the situation was really sad. But the woman couldn't focus much on that because her phone vibrates again. And this time it was the cafe manager, saying it would be better if she took a month off to recover and sort everything out, assuring her she would pay for the last 2 weeks worked and apologizing for not being able to help more. That news makes Miso even more desperate, because now she not only had to find a way to pay for Seojin's school, the enrollment fee and his uniform, and the fee for the afternoon shift, but also had to take care of her normal household bills. And not only that, she should start worrying about her own college enrollment. The girl stands there, frozen in the hospital hallway, devastated, not knowing what to do, until an idea comes to her mind, making the protagonist raise her face to face yet another challenge. She would have to accept Loca's proposal, trusting that he really was a god, and that making this deal wouldn't leave her regretting it for the rest of her life. So the girl walks toward the god, who was already drooling from sleeping so much in that hard hospital chair. Miso calls him, without much success, and then insists. But again, the boy remains still, until she decides to act crazy and scream in the middle of the hospital, a method that is much more effective and makes the guy get up instantly. Loca asks what the hell was going on, but the girl just tells him to get up once and for all, and explains that he couldn't just sleep there, so it was better to wash his face in the bathroom. And then, noticing that the girl stopped in the middle of the sentence, the boy asks what came after. Gathering courage, the girl explains that after that, they could continue their discussion from the day before. That actually excites the boy, and he jumps from the chair with a smug smile, saying that he was excited to continue the talk. In one of the cafes nearby, some people were chatting, and among them were Miso, Loca, and even poor Hyunjae, who had been dragged along. The woman tries not to waste more time, placing her hands on the table to start the subject with tension. Serious? Miso asks what exactly that god wanted from her, while Loca stares at the protagonist, tense. Suddenly, he gets up without saying a word, leaving Hyunjae confused. And the servant even tries to talk to him. However, Loca is serious when telling the boy to go look after Seojin, explaining that as soon as they finished sorting their matters, he would go after him. But he hadn't done that because the talk would be heavy or anything like that. It was just that staying alone in the hospital wasn't good for a child. And that care surprises Miso. Even so, his servant was reluctant to go. But the boy pouts, saying he wasn't a helpless child. With that settled, he extends his hand to Miso, calling her to a more private place. She asks where exactly he was going, but Loca doesn't answer. He just gives his usual ironic smile. While extending his hand, still unsure whether she should trust the boy or not, the protagonist thought it was very weird. After all, a day ago she would have rejected anything from that man without thinking twice. But sealing their hands, she felt she could give some trust to Loca. And then, just like the day before, he transports her with his magic. The girl had her eyes shut tightly, as if that could protect her from any serious impact. But when she opened them, she was surprised. She was inside an apartment, not on the rooftop like in their other discussion. But it wasn't just any apartment. It was her apartment, with everything in the same place she had left it. While Miso freaks out, wanting to know how the god had done that thing, Loca observes the house, noticing it was very different from what he expected, and questioning how human beings manage to eat, sleep, or do anything in such a small space. The boy goes to the balcony asking why it wasn't bigger, until he noticed a small clothesline there. And picking up a piece of the girl's underwear, he asked what that piece of cloth was supposed to be. Meanwhile, Miso was frying her brains. Grabbing her clothing, she screams, pushing the guy away to keep him far from there. The protagonist was visibly stressed and wanted to know what that guy was thinking invading her house like that. But he didn't understand what was wrong with that unbalanced woman. So she explains she hadn't even managed to tidy the house. But that goes unnoticed by the boy, who asks Miso to come closer. When she does, she is confused, not knowing the reason for the request. Then the boy intertwines their hands again, making her nervous and pulling her arm back hard. That's when the TV shines brightly, revealing the image of Hera, the person Miso once was. She asks if that was the woman Loca always talked about, and he answers that actually, that was her, which leaves our girl a bit confused. Then he explains that she was Hera in her past life, that majestic and famous woman. Even to Loca, the girl was the most beautiful in the world. And then, being sincere, he explains to Miso that what he needed from her were her memories from when she was still Hera. But the girl couldn't understand how to do that. So the boy says he could help by extracting the memories of her past life directly from Miso's subconscious while she was asleep, which makes the girl question what would happen after that. So the boy explains that when he had collected enough memories, the fire ring that lived inside the girl would reveal itself. Even though she was nervous, the girl asks if that was really all. But there was still a small detail. There was one more thing Loca needed. That was the devotion of the woman in front of him that he despised so much. That idea was at the very least absurd. Even so, the god continues, saying that as the owner of the fire ring, she needed to explicitly recognize him as the next god of the sky. And she had to do that with all the sincerity and respect she could manage. The girl feels relieved with the request, laughing as she realizes what devotion really meant. And her reaction makes Loca ask what she thought it meant. But it was better for Miso not to answer. So she just changed the subject, moving to the part that interested her. She needed to know what she would gain from that. And Loca asks a very simple question. What do you want? The girl thinks for a moment. Then the god interrupts, saying that he knew humans tended to be very materialistic with these requests. So he could have a good idea of what Miso wanted. He asks for the girl's hand, which makes her nervous again, feeling those fingers intertwining with hers. And all blushing, she tells the boy to stop holding her hand like that out of nowhere. But Loca was fearless and explains that he had lost his powers, something that was the worst thing possible to happen to a god. But his father had left the powers available for use in the presence of the successor of the fire goddess, which meant he could use them with Miso, including that this was proof that she really was the successor of the role. And that talk leaves her confused. The girl tells the boy to stop talking about that kind of thing. But Loca argues, explaining that what he meant is that now they were in a relationship that would benefit both. Only that if she wanted the help of his powers, she would have to let him hold her hand. And so she does. Not that she had many options. Suddenly, the girl's phone rings and she answers, still with her hands intertwined with the gods. It was her boss saying she needed her to come back next month, leaving Miso a little confused. And then the woman explains that she got a call from the owners. And even though she didn't know what happened, the girl had gotten a 20% raise, which makes the girl scream. She turns to Loca, not believing that was really happening. But the god remains neutral with the same ironic and smug smile as always. Even though she was in shock, Miso thanks her, saying she would be there next month. After hanging up the call, Loca comments that the girl was very different from other humans, because he thought her deep wishes would be more ambitious, like having a big property or fame. But that didn't matter. What really mattered to the boy was that now the girl had a debt with him. Miso looks at him nervously, wondering if that was really her life now. But then she squeezes the hand of her new partner, with whom she would have to spend some good days. Miso stared at Loca as if she could pierce his skin with just one look. Meanwhile, poor Hyunjae tried to bring the two back to reality so they could settle the living together agreement, which included some essential things. First, they should avoid physical contact unless they needed to teleport. Loca had to promise to stop reading the girl's mind and be generous when using his powers in favor of the protagonist, considering her job and her whole life. He also couldn't tell Seojin the truth about the money Miso lost and needed to respect her boundaries. Not only that, but they would also use separate bathrooms, and the god had to follow the girl's guidance and requests always. Like when she asked Loca to pick up her nephew at school. Surprising the deity, Miso says that if he wanted, he could write his own terms too, so the relationship wouldn't be unequal. Then, with his usual superior pose, the boy starts, using the pen as if he were making a great judgment worthy of a god, writing that the human should share the bed with him every night. When Hyunji takes a look at it, he comments that it was fantastic, and Miso gets embarrassed with that clause. But honestly, at that point, she didn't care much anymore. Looking at his watch, the god gets up, saying it was time for them to go, and the woman asks what he was talking about, to which he replies that the two would have to sleep together right then, making the girl scream and drawing the attention of the people nearby. He was already ready to explain that this would be their first night together when he was stopped by the girl who covered his mouth, telling him to shut up. Desperate, Miso insisted for him to stop talking. She was as red as a pepper, and the boy pushes her hands away from his mouth, surprised by that reaction. Loca asks what exactly was the problem and confesses to being very patient. After all, that would be the first of many nights together, and that's why it should last the whole night. His words leave the ladies around shocked. And again, Miso tells him to stop talking that kind of thing that opened room for other interpretations. The clock was running fast, and Loca stared at Miso with a piercing look, while the girl explained that she understood the situation he was in, but it would be very good if he could stop acting that way. A request that the boy couldn't meet, because he was fixated on the clock like a maniac. Out of patience, the girl threatens to take the clock off the wall if her new roommate didn't stop acting that way. But she is scolded by Loca. Still, she moves closer to the object, ready to put it away and try to have some peace again in her own house. But Hyunjae comes out of her wall, surprising her and explaining to his master that he was there to explain the protocol for extracting the memories. But his sudden appearance makes Miso scream from the scare. After she regains her senses, the servant explains that he had only come there because he forgot to give the proper instructions to Loca, and he didn't think the girl would freak out because of that. To which she replies that he could simply use the front door like a normal person. Meanwhile, the god was celebrating the presence of his colleague there. Before he can give the explanations, the woman asks who was with her nephew at that moment, to which Hyunjae answers that he was in the bathroom, and asks indignantly if he didn't have the right to a single break and if Miso wanted him glued to that child. While Loca tells the boy to focus again and explain, then Hyunjae forces a cough to return to the subject he was going to talk about. He explains that first and most important for his master to be able to extract the memories and find the fire ring, the girl would need to be asleep. Something that the god understands quickly, asking the boy to continue. After Miso fell asleep and was in that state where her memories could be extracted, a blue light would shine on her forehead. And that surprises Miso, who cannot help but comment that it was like living a fantasy story, but in real life. Her comment leaves the boys completely unbelieving that the girl had actually said that, and she apologizes. Trying to ignore the interruption, Hyunjae continues, saying that as soon as that blue light appeared, his master would take his own ring, which was what represented his status as the son of the sun god, and he would bring it close to the blue light. Then Hera's memories would appear right in front of his eyes, before flowing directly into his ring. That seemed like just something cool and normal to Loca, but for Miso, being in contact with the divinity was impressive. However, Hyunjae warns that there was a small detail. Since Loca had lost all his powers, there was a small problem. Before he can explain, he hears Seojin calling, who apparently had come out of the bathroom and now wanted to play with him. That surprises the boy a little, who is left without knowing what to say. He asks the child to wait a little and says goodbye to the two without finishing his explanation. But Loca doesn't even notice that. He only thanks Hyunjae for the work and assures that he would take care of things from then on. And Miso asks again that he be careful with her nephew. So the boy disappears into the wall, closing that portal. Now the two were completely alone and would have to endure each other's company for an indefinite time. Loca looks at Miso without much expression, before calling her by her name, saying that it was time for them to lie down, something she would have to accept unwillingly. And her acceptance makes him a little more excited about things, thinking that this was already a good start. Besides, the god thought that as soon as the girl fell asleep, the rest would be very simple to do, while Miso only wished deeply that it all worked. But in Loca's thoughts, he already considered himself the next sun god, and thought it was only a matter of time. When they finally went to lie down, the boy made sure to make the atmosphere comfortable, and waited for the girl to fall into a deep sleep, while she was sitting in her office chair. He watched her for hours, from 1 in the morning until 3. But the girl didn't fall asleep at all and was already getting nervous. He comes closer to Miso's bed and asks how she hadn't slept yet, telling the girl to hurry up, but she explains that it wasn't that simple, because she had forgotten to mention one little thing. Hyunjae had to go there to solve it, but he was very nervous, shouting to ask why she didn't tell them before that she had insomnia. Laughing nervously, the protagonist asks if they didn't know many things about human beings, and explains that most of them couldn't simply turn off the lights and sleep whenever they wanted, which was a big problem for the two. Then Hyunjae finishes his earlier thought, saying that since his master had lost his powers, the memory extraction had to happen before sunrise, which makes me so worried. And then the boy asks Loca that they forget about it for today, since it was already 4 in the morning. And Miso tries to be optimistic, saying that they would try again the next day. The servant still comments that if Loca hadn't lost his powers, this wouldn't be happening, which makes the god of light even more stressed with the situation, going after his servant to ask if he was trying to make him even more stressed, and telling the boy to shut up. But the guy argues that he knew he was right, and there was nothing to do about it. However, the fight between the two is interrupted by Miso, who explains that she still needed to sleep. But the two don't even listen, because they were too busy hitting each other. It didn't take long for the day to break. After all, it was 4 in the morning when all that discussion happened, and Miso gets up, calling Loca's attention, and saying that she was going to visit her nephew, then go to the university. The protagonist also asks that the god try to rest a little. After all, the two had had quite a night. Meanwhile, the boy was lying in bed, grumbling from so much sleep. But she doesn't expect any conclusive answer from the god and just leaves the room, leaving him there. As soon as the girl leaves the room, Loca throws his eye patch at the door in anger. He was outraged because he had no idea how the girl managed it, just living her life without sleeping. Not even for 5 minutes. It was at least revolting. So he gets up, asking if the girl was still at home, because he wanted to go with her on her tasks. But to his bad luck, she was already on the street, lost in thought about everything. While waiting for her bus, she reflected on how stressed she was with herself. After all, it wasn't like she had stayed awake on purpose. She just couldn't sleep even though she really wanted to. She was almost getting in when the god appeared, shouting for her to wait. However, the girl didn't notice and got on the bus anyway. Trying not to feel so guilty, after all, she was the one with insomnia in that whole situation. Seeing the bus moving away, the boy shouts, as if the girl could really hear him from in there. And then he just stands there in the middle of the street like an old man. That's when he noticed someone very familiar inside the same bus as Miso. It was his brother Vero, who was surely plotting something again. Meanwhile, inside the bus, Miso had managed to get a seat since it was pretty empty inside. But to her bad luck, she was very sleepy and wasn't even sure she could open her eyes if she nodded off any longer. Even so, she tried to stay awake because she couldn't miss the hospital stop. That's when she noticed the approach of a boy who looked very familiar, especially his smug smile. It doesn't take long for the girl to fall asleep, and Vero takes the chance to get close to her, sitting by her side, sure that he had gotten exactly what he wanted. At the medical center, he put on his doctor disguise, leaving the girl on one of the available hospital beds, still in a deep sleep. Vero moves closer to her face, carefully so she wouldn't wake up, touching her forehead so he could access all her memories. However, this sends an alert to Loca, who shouts for the girl in the middle of the street. And somehow he manages to send out a kind of signal for the girl to wake up at once, making her shiver a little. Then she wakes up, commenting that she had a great nap, until realizing where she was, getting disoriented. and asking herself where exactly she had ended up. When someone celebrates the fact that she woke up by offering her a cup of coffee, the protagonist screams in fright. It was Vero in front of her, and she recognizes having seen the psychiatrist a few days ago, while he asks if she liked coffee. After accepting the cup, Miso asks what she was doing there. Then he explains that she had fainted on the bus, something that scares the girl. However, she was more interested in knowing how that boy managed to bring her to the hospital, already imagining that he had carried her through the hallways bravely like in a romance book, telling everyone to get out of the way. But that wasn't an ideal scenario for the girl, who didn't want to be seen as a damsel in distress. Watching the girl's reactions, the boy can't help but comment that her face was very expressive, making her tremble. Then he explains that he pretended there was an emergency happening and then decided to bring her to that room. But she didn't need to worry. Then the girl thanks him. However, she asks why he had brought her to his office. And the boy answers kindly that he just thought the woman wouldn't want her nephew to see her feeling sick. And since it looked like she needed to rest, he figured she could sleep there. And after she woke up, she would visit Seojin in his room. His answer surprises the girl. After all, the two didn't even know each other, and he had shown all that consideration for her. But she didn't want to waste any more time. So she thanks him for the help, saying she would leave immediately. But Vero asks her to wait because he had something to ask Miso. She gets a bit curious, but the fake doctor asks her not to be nervous because it was something about her nephew. And that mention is enough to make her even more nervous than she had been since waking up in that strange room with that charming boy. Then he explains that Seojin's IQ was much more advanced than children his age, and he rests his cup, commenting that he must be a very smart kid. Then he explains that he was working on a thesis about gifted children who were dealing with post-traumatic stress. And with her permission, he would like to have more conversations with Seojin and run a few more tests. In my opinion, that research was way too convenient. But the woman gets serious because he was basically suggesting to treat her precious nephew as a test subject. However, the boy keeps his friendly pose, explaining that of course his legal guardians would participate in the research, because the goal was to understand a little more about the bond between children and their guardians. But he can't finish the explanation, because the protagonist quickly stands up and very harshly says he should find someone else to participate. However, before she leaves the room, Vero explains that she would be rewarded for giving her time. And that makes Miso stop walking right away. She bites her lips, unsure of what to do. But she turns to the doctor, ready to give him quite an answer. After their conversation, she marches out of the room going after Seojin. And on the way, she runs into Loca, which surprises her a lot, because the god didn't usually care much about her. But now there he was, wanting to know if she was okay. To which the girl answers that it was better for him not to talk to her at that moment because she was in a terrible mood. The woman wondered how that doctor had the nerve to suggest that she sell her own nephew. And unconsciously, Loca ends up reading that thought, shocked by it. Miso was taken over by terrible guilt, because she had always felt that she was the reason Seojin was an orphan now, as if it were her fault he was suffering so much. And the image of the boy's parents' funeral comes to her mind, making Miso's eyes fill with tears, and the guilt weighed on her shoulders more than ever. Loca breaks her silence, asking why she thought everything was her fault. And that surprises the girl, who reminds him that they had agreed he would stop reading her mind without her permission. But the god doesn't care much about that. He just says it was an accident and continues their talk, explaining that the girl was also young, and she was a victim of circumstance. But the protagonist didn't see things that way and breaks into tears, saying that if she hadn't asked the boy's parents to go out so late to buy something for her, none of this would have happened. The girl gets lost in her own words while trying to argue against Loca's points. After all, to her, it made much more sense that everything was her fault. The boy is left speechless because it reminded him of something very dark that had happened in his life. When he was little, he was being held by two of his father's servants, crying and explaining that he had called the girl to go with him, and she hadn't done anything wrong. Meanwhile, the servant was being taken by two of the Sun King's soldiers, asking her master to stay strong, and the boy shouted for Yuri not to be taken. That sudden memory terrifies him. That's when he realizes the girl had already stopped crying, telling him to forget it and that he shouldn't even be talking about this kind of thing now. After all, she was Seojin's legal guardian, and in moments like this, she needed to act more like her sister used to. And thinking about it a bit, she was sure her sister would have crushed that stuck-up doctor, wondering how he dared to think about messing with a child's trauma for the sake of research. She definitely wouldn't give in. Loca widens his eyes at so much information at once, before putting his hand to his forehead and commenting that he was definitely trying. Meanwhile, in his new office, Vero reflects, remembering Miso's words earlier when she angrily said that she knew she didn't have that many resources to give her nephew. But she definitely wouldn't hand him over on a silver platter to the first team of researchers who offered to pay for him. Still, he smiles smug as always, as if nothing could really shake him, until his servant shows up saying she didn't understand, surprising him with her presence. The girl approaches from behind him, asking why Vero kept wasting his time in vain on that land. And she asks why he didn't use his powers to steal Miso's memories. But just that suggestion gave the boy chills. As bad as he was, Vero turns to Seojin and asks if she had already found a way to finish Loca once and for all like he had asked some time ago. But she answers that if her master had a specific deadline for her to carry out this task, she would hurry to do it. Then, Vero explains that the god of the clouds had informed that tomorrow, by 2 in the afternoon, would be good enough, and the girl confirms that she would have everything ready. With that matter solved, the boy uses his powers, which had not been limited by his father like Loca's, taking the opportunity to spy on his brother and Miso with a kind of crystal ball, seeing that they were arguing about something. The god was fascinated by the protagonist, and he couldn't help but comment how, even in another life, the girl was still brilliant. And his comment makes Seojin jealous. She tries to change the focus, asking her master if he had already extracted Miso's memories, to which he answers that apparently this would be much harder than he imagined. Vero strengthens his crystal ball, squeezing it hard, and retrieving memories that seem to be from Miso's childhood. When Seojin asks who those little girls fighting were, the god immediately cuts her off, saying that it definitely wasn't a memory of Hera. The boy was already impatient, commenting that apparently that task of getting the fire ring would take much longer than expected to be completed. Meanwhile, in another room, some people were sharing an apple, and a little boy was talking with Seojin, asking if that old woman sitting there was his aunt, who took care of him. Something he confirms, even though Miso felt offended by the mention of her age. Even so, he continues, asking if the handsome guy next to her was Seojin's uncle, but the boy didn't really know how to answer. So he decides to say that he was just some guy who slept with his aunt, and that was enough to make poor Miso spit her snack in Loca's face. And that was enough to make the guardian of that boy take him out of the room while Miso screamed, freaking out because her nephew thought she was actually going out with Loca. The 3 boys watched the protagonist while she had her little anger fit, looking like a mad dog, until Loca calls the attention of his servant, who immediately answers him. And he asks if the servant had already found a way to solve their situation. To which the boy answers yes, explaining that first they needed to extract Miso's memories, at least if she managed to sleep, because otherwise all their efforts would be in vain. And that comment sounded like a jab to the girl. Even so, Hyunjae continues, revealing that he had researched the 5 most effective methods for a perfect night's sleep, which leaves Miso a bit offended, and the god even more interested. He starts by saying that first it was important for the girl to expose herself to the sun and exercise, because according to his research, sunlight helped with psoriasis, raised body temperature, and improved mood swings, while activating important hormones and raising vitamin D levels, promoting both physical and emotional health. The girl felt like she was in a real class, shocked by the creature's research, who finished that topic saying that all this should help Miso relax and, consequently, sleep in a more comfortable way. But the protagonist goes to him asking what exactly all that information meant, to which the servant answers that basically she and Loca had to take a walk from time to time, and considering that this should happen at least 5 hours before she went to sleep, it was ideal to start now. However, the woman says that she couldn't just leave and go walk in the street at that moment. After all, she had work tasks and needed to worry about her nephew. The 2 boys look at her seriously, making her ask what they were looking at. Then, Hyunjae reminds her of a small detail. Her part-time job wouldn't start until the next month, which meant that, for now, she was unemployed. And that hits her directly in the chest. But besides that, Loca takes the chance to remind her that Seojin was under Hyunji's care. And even the little boy interferes, giving the final blow by asking since when his aunt did any house chores. The woman was down on the floor as if she had taken a real slap, with all those offenses to her ego. However, Loca extends his hand to her, telling the woman to compose herself quickly. He had no patience and makes it clear that he didn't like that idea either, but it was better for them to finish it quickly. Defeated by the god's arguments, the woman gives in extending her hand to speed up the process. As soon as they seal the handshake, the magic surrounds them as usual, and they are teleported to a beautiful park in the city, where many people were doing their outdoor activities as usual. Arriving there, even if it wasn't the best activity, the protagonist had to admit that it was a very nice place. Besides, it seemed like years since she last came to that place. A mother walking with her son catches her attention because the little boy was showing a pretty flower he found in the square to the woman. This scene makes her melancholic, and the protagonist comments that probably the last time she was there, her nephew was about the age of that child she saw. But Loca wasn't interested in any emotional nonsense, and reminds Miso that she needed to get as much sunlight as possible, and they weren't there to relax or anything like that. They were there to put her in a peaceful state before sleeping, to help her sleep. The comment makes the girl let out an ironic laugh. After all, it wasn't that simple. And she asks if this sleeping thing was really that easy for the gods. And shrugging, she comments how Loca was lucky. After all, he never had any difficulty in his entire life. The boy doesn't answer or argue. He just observes the sun, thoughtful about what he should say. Then, he comments how ironic it was that they were instructed to get sunlight because it would help with sleep, and yet they had to turn off all the lights when going to bed, which makes him remember his father, questioning if it was really that god's responsibility to share his graces. The boy starts walking, leaving Miso confused since he hadn't given any instruction or anything like that. The girl runs to catch up with him, asking what had happened for him to change so suddenly, since he seemed very thoughtful. And she knew what she was talking about, because usually she was that person, which makes him be ironic, asking if that was really the case. The protagonist stares at him, not really knowing what to say, and trying to figure out on her own if she could ask what she wanted. But she decides to risk it, saying it was just out of curiosity. But she doesn't even manage to ask what she wants, because Loca already interrupts, saying she didn't need to know anything. That harsh answer makes the girl even more stressed, and she changes her tone, saying there was no problem at all in just going back home and not helping in Loca's mission. Then the boy tries to calm down, sighing before answering that he was in the line of succession to become the next sun god. And Miso makes a comparison, trying to understand that and asking if he was like the heir to everything. After all, for her, it was already crazy enough to think that boy in front of her could be called a god. Now imagine how hard it was to become the sun god that illuminated everything. And the boy replies, saying that no mission worthy of his attention would be simple, until she finally realizes something and decides to ask. She wanted to know if her dreams were really as important as he said. After all, without access to them, and consequently without Miso's help, Loca couldn't become the next sun god. The boy stares at her. He didn't know exactly what she wanted with all that talk, while Miso looked deeply at him, with a smile he had never seen the girl give him before. The god shakes his head, trying to push away his thoughts, and asks what made her think she could say that kind of thing about the king of all gods, who in this case was his father. To which she replies that it was actually a great question, and then reveals that she was an atheist. And that does shock the god. But the girl doesn't back down and just questions why Loca wanted so much to be the king of all gods anyway, and if it was just because he was the man's son. Of course it sounded like an important job, but she insists on questioning if that was really what the boy in front of her wanted. And he stays silent for a few seconds, not knowing exactly how to answer. That makes the protagonist nervous. And then she asks what had happened for him to be staring at her in such a deep way. The boy comments that he needed to know something that for him would be very important. And that mysterious line manages to make the protagonist even more interested. The truth is that Loca needed to know why Hera did that to him, but that wasn't something he was willing to reveal to that human. This conversation brings back memories of when his servant begged him to return to his chambers, because it had been 30 minutes since Hera, with whom at the time he was in a relationship, had made an extremely important decision. The woman wanted to be reborn as a mortal, something the god didn't accept, and he screamed that it was impossible, that it couldn't be happening. While the doors closed in his face, he could only ask himself why his beloved chose reincarnation, and why she had abandoned him. After that tense atmosphere, the two continued their walk, and it didn't take long for them to return to Miso's house. While the girl commented how good it was to disappear and take a walk, Loca cuts the mood, telling her not to forget that all of this was for her sleep. Suddenly, the girl is taken by an intense glow that almost makes her eyes hurt. The house was spotless, and she wondered what had happened there. But for Loca, this kind of thing was normal, and he comments that apparently Hyunjae had passed by quickly. which makes the protagonist comment that she couldn't remember the last time she got home and found everything clean. But the boy was impatient and said they didn't have all night. They needed to focus on the original mission. But the girl was more interested in exploring her apartment and asked what smell she was sensing. That's when she came across the table full of delicious foods. Using his little teleport portal, Yoonji appears explaining that he took the liberty of preparing a dinner for Miso because he read on the internet that balanced meals were also very good to help with sleep, which impresses the girl. And he had chosen what to do by accessing Sandra's memories, since the girl wasn't around. Loca watches the two impatient, and then he sits down, telling her to eat quickly. The girl settles in, ready to devour that entire meal. So the two share a dinner, even if the atmosphere was very strange. After all the necessary rituals to improve the human's sleep, all that was left was for her to sleep. Then the boy offers to turn off the lights to set the mood in the room. Already in bed, the protagonist comments that everything was very strange, and she felt like she was going back in time. Something that didn't interest the god at all, who only comments that this was a good thing and tells her to fall asleep quickly. Still, our girl keeps talking, confessing that it had been years since she felt able to sleep so early. The god was almost letting smoke out of his ears and nose when he answered that the girl had had many problems for too long, so she should take the chance to rest once and for all. However, there was one issue. She felt sad, but she couldn't keep talking much more about it because she closed her eyes right after. Like the night before, Loca watches her for a while in silence, without making any sudden movement so as not to make her restless, and then asks if the girl had finally fallen asleep. After all, she hadn't given any other sign otherwise. Noticing her silence, he decides to get closer to confirm he wasn't having a hallucination from so much anxiety, shaking the girl lightly. That was the only thing capable of making the god of light so excited. And he had to hold himself back from shouting in celebration, calling for his servant to show that they had reached the goal. But that moment didn't last long, because a light began to shine on Miso's face exactly as expected. That was enough to make Loca's eyes shine too. He couldn't believe he was so close to everything he always wanted since he came back to that world. The night passed in a flash, and it didn't take long for someone to try to wake the girl up, who grumbles, telling that person to go away. That's when she realized something very important lying there in her bed. She opens her eyes wide, not believing what was happening, quickly getting up from bed when she saw the image of her sister. The woman was holding Seojin, who was still a baby, in her arms, and scolding Miso because she spent the whole night having to take care of the boy, and now had to deal with a rebellious teenager. Without giving space for the girl to say anything, the woman reminds the protagonist that they had agreed to go for a walk in the park, and they had already planned this for a month. Even her husband was busy with some chore, making sandwiches in the kitchen. That happening left our girl extremely confused. But the woman didn't even notice and just tells her younger sister to hurry again, informing that she had already even eaten the crusts of the bread, which leaves the glutton outraged, asking how she had simply eaten all the good parts by herself. To which her sister replies that if she wanted to eat with her, she had to wake up earlier next time. When they arrive at the park, the day is beautiful, and many people enjoy it just like them. Now they were sitting at a picnic with a margarine commercial family, and Seojin was also having fun even though he was just a baby. Even if she was enjoying it, it was strange because she couldn't eat that food and enjoy it. The taste was good, but for some reason her throat was very dry. That's when she noticed the drops running down her face. The girl had been taken by immense emotion and didn't know exactly why she was crying so much, until Seojin walks towards her with the clumsy steps of a baby, and Miso forgets about the food and the tears, happy with the boy's spontaneous approach. However, when her sister tries to talk to her, the protagonist can't understand a single word. Everything her brother-in-law and sister said was blurred in her mind, so she asks them to speak a little louder. But then the girl is taken by some lights, as if she were fading away. And desperate, she repeats that she couldn't hear and asks what was happening because she was very scared. But the couple is not affected and keeps talking as if everything was normal. That's when the protagonist tries to reach the two of them, but they are taken by a tremendous darkness that makes Miso scream, begging her sister not to abandon her. Suddenly, the girl wakes up completely scared in her bed. She looks around, realizing that in the real world it was already day, and she slowly gets up, wondering when was the last time she slept that well, and concluding that it had probably been years. The girl was commenting on how rested she felt when she noticed Loca there in the corner of the room like some kind of ghost, asking if she had rested. His presence scares her, and the girl lets out a scream. She had completely forgotten about the god's presence there and asks how long he had been sitting like that, while the boy kept his maniac pose, until he stands up shouting to ask what was wrong with that woman, leaving her very confused. He was out of his mind and questions if, awake or asleep, she had fun messing with his life. But the girl didn't know what he was talking about, so she asks what was wrong and if his plan hadn't worked. After all, she had slept the whole night. Then the boy accuses her, shocked at the protagonist pretending and calling her pathetic. He even felt sorry for himself for needing the help of such an ignorant human like her. After all, she had gotten a walk, a clean apartment, and even a dinner cooked by someone else completely for free, plus the best night of sleep of her life. But our girl didn't understand why Loca was throwing that in her face. Then he explains that she hadn't dreamed of anything. He had stayed awake the whole night and couldn't get any memory from the girl. Basically, she had taken advantage of him for everything he had to offer her, and in return gave nothing. He didn't even know anymore if that woman in front of him was really Hera's reincarnation. Without waiting for the girl to react, he asks if by any chance she dreamed in general, because it seemed not, since her head was just empty. He didn't even give her the chance to answer the first question before saying she probably didn't even think, saying how a head on those shoulders was useless and how he was the idiot for expecting a human to use her brain at night when she barely managed to use it while awake, referring to Miso as just any mortal and complaining that he had wasted his time. All of this piled up inside the woman who was dying of anger, and all she does is tell him to leave, extremely serious to the point of scaring him. With no patience at all, she shouts again, saying he should get out immediately. Sometime later, at the hospital, the young woman hands over a card, explaining that it should cover all the expenses, and the receptionist gives the receipt back to Miso, who was accompanied by Loca, who still had his death-like expression, while asking them not to forget to come to the next checkup on time. Trying to lighten the mood, she comments that the two had married very young, asking if this was the case or if they just had good genetics and looked younger. But just this idea offends the two, since they would never be involved. In the bad atmosphere, the poor receptionist regrets it, while they insist she had gotten everything wrong, burning inside and out in their answer, making the woman apologize. She just watches, while our favorite couple keeps arguing, telling each other to move away and complaining about being stuck together all the time. Loca even thought about answering Miso badly, but he was trying to focus on being the responsible one in that relationship, and for that, he would have to give up some things. The girl turns her back to the receptionist who calls her attention, explaining that Seojin had a psychiatric appointment scheduled with Dr. Vero at 2 in the afternoon. And this catches Miso's and Loca's attention for very different reasons, making the girl even confirm that she had heard the doctor's name right, who would see her nephew. So that's where we'll stop for now. What did you think about everything that happened? Do you think Miso will really be able to trust Loca after all that tension? To be honest, I thought it was funny that the protagonist's name is Miso. It reminds me of my name, Misa. Could it be that I'll also find my god to date? Also, do you believe Miso's dreams will finally reveal her past as Hera? Or will Loca lose his chance to become the next god of the sun? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. The name of this story is My Boyfriend is a God, and I narrated up to chapter 20. It's a short and fun story, and if you guys enjoy it, I'll bring part 2 and the ending. D kisses. And see you next time.